My sister waited until nearly 200 people were watching before she decided to explain my place in the family. I had just finished answering a question from her wedding planner when Sabrina lifted her champagne glass, laughed, and said, "She doesn't run anything. Send her to the kitchen." A few people chuckled because they thought she was joking. I looked at Sabrina, then at the planner standing beside me with her tablet still open. I could have explained exactly what I ran. I could have listed the 5 venues, the staff, the budgets, the emergencies that somehow always ended on my desk. Instead, I said, "Give her exactly what she asked for." 10 minutes later, dinner stopped. Sabrina came through the kitchen doors with her face burning red and demanded, "What did you do?" I picked up my bag, looked my little sister in the eye, and said, "I gave you control." Before I tell you how my sister's wedding dinner came to a complete stop, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from today. Stay with me, because what happened during those 10 minutes turned out to be the smallest part of what my family had been arranging behind my back. And if you enjoy stories about family, betrayal, and the moment someone finally stops cleaning up everybody else's mess, subscribe to the channel and stay with me, because this one went much further than a ruined floral wall. The strange thing was, I had not gone to Sabrina's wedding intending to prove anything. It was Saturday, December 6th, and Hawthorne Hall looked exactly the way she had spent a year making sure it would look. White roses climbed the stone columns. Candlelight ran down the long tables. The ballroom ceiling disappeared behind soft fabric and hundreds of tiny lights. Sabrina had always been good at presentation, and that night she had outdone herself. She was also my younger sister, and until that evening, I had been genuinely happy for her. I had no interest in turning her wedding into another argument about Caldwell Event Group. In fact, 3 weeks earlier, Sabrina had been the one who asked me to be her emergency contact for anything operational. Her exact words had been, "If a vendor catches fire, call Renee. If Aunt Linda hates her table, call me." That distinction mattered to me. I was vice president of operations for Caldwell Event Group, the company our father had built over 3 decades. Hawthorne Hall was one of our 5 properties, which meant I knew the building, the staff, and its procedures better than almost anyone in the room. But that night I was supposed to be Sabrina's sister first. So when her planner, Caroline, approached me during cocktails and quietly asked whether a late rental delivery could use the west loading entrance, I answered the question, pointed her toward the venue manager, and went back to my table. When she returned 20 minutes later, because the photographer wanted an equipment case moved from a service doorway, I handled that too. Neither problem took more than a minute. Neither required Sabrina. Apparently, 2 minutes of competence were already too many. Sabrina had been standing with 2 bridesmaids when Caroline approached me for the second time. I noticed my sister watching us. She kept smiling. But it was the smile Sabrina used when she wanted a photograph to look effortless. Her shoulders had gone stiff. A few feet away, Martin Hayes, one of our independent directors, looked around the ballroom and made the kind of harmless comment people make when they have no idea they are stepping on an old bruise. "Looks like your sister's running the whole place." Sabrina laughed. Then she looked directly at me. "She doesn't run anything," she said. "Send her to the kitchen." The bridesmaid beside her stopped smiling. Caroline's hand froze over her tablet. Even Martin looked as if he wished he could pull the sentence back out of the air. Sabrina, however, took another sip of champagne and smiled at me as though she had merely corrected someone's pronunciation. What bothered me most was not that she had embarrassed me. At 38, I was well past the age when my little sister could destroy my self-esteem with one sentence. What bothered me was that less than 6 hours earlier, she had personally told Caroline to bring operational questions to me so Sabrina could enjoy her own wedding. I gave Caroline a small nod toward her tablet. "Give her exactly what she asked for." Caroline studied my face. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." I did not march out of the ballroom. I did not throw down a headset or make a speech about respect. I simply walked through the service doors and into the back corridor. If Sabrina wanted every discretionary wedding decision routed through the bride, then that was exactly what would happen. She was the executive decision-maker for her wedding. I had no intention of arguing with her about the privilege she had just demanded in front of 200 witnesses. Marcus Reed was standing near the kitchen entrance checking the staffing schedule when he saw me. He had worked with me long enough to recognize my expression before I said a word. Please tell me you didn't finally murder someone at a family event. Not yet. Good. HR hates December paperwork. Despite myself, I laughed. Elena Ruiz came around the corner carrying a radio and gave me one look. What happened? My authority has apparently been revoked. Marcus raised an eyebrow. By whom? The bride. Elena looked toward the ballroom doors. Your sister? No, Elena. A different bride who happens to look exactly like her. That earned me the smallest smile. It was one reason I trusted Elena. She could tell when I needed advice and when I needed 30 seconds to be irritated before I was capable of hearing it. I had barely finished speaking when Caroline came through the doors behind me. Her expression had changed from uncomfortable to worried. Renee, the florist is asking again about the East Corridor installation. I looked at her. Then she caught herself. Right, she said. Bride. She turned around and went back out. The East Corridor was not an aesthetic debate, although Sabrina had spent weeks treating it like one. It connected the staging kitchen to the ballroom and was the route the banquet staff used for plated dinner service. Hot carts did not roll through the guest foyer during dinner. That was not one of my personal quirks. It was how Hawthorne Hall handled service flow and safety. Sabrina's florist had designed a large floral installation that partially screened the corridor entrance from photographs, and the venue team had already explained that the opening had to remain clear while dinner was being served. Sabrina knew that. Caroline knew it. The banquet director knew it. For months, whenever that question came up, someone eventually looked at me. That night, I had just told them not to. A few minutes later, Marcus glanced at his watch. We're getting close to first course. I know. You want me to check the ballroom? No. He studied me carefully. You sure? No, I said, but I'm still not going. That answer surprised him. It surprised me too. For years, my instinct had been simple. If I saw a problem, I solved it. If somebody else was about to make a mistake, I stepped in before the mistake became expensive. I had always told myself that was professionalism. Most of the time it was. But somewhere along the way, I had also become very good at preventing people from experiencing the consequences of decisions they insisted on making. At 6:58, the banquet director came out of the staging kitchen. East Corridor is closed. Marcus looked at me. I kept my mouth shut. The director continued. Floral team finished the wall. We can't move carts through there. Who approved it? Elena asked. Bride confirmed with planner. There it was. Not my decision. Not my approval. Not my problem to reverse. The banquet director looked at me out of habit. We'll hold plating until they open the route. I nodded once. Follow venue procedure. That was all I said. Nobody dumped food in the trash. Nobody left 200 people starving while I sat in the kitchen enjoying revenge. Past appetizers were still circulating. The kitchen kept everything at the proper holding temperature. The only thing that stopped was the launch of plated dinner, because the route designed to move it had just been blocked by several $1,000s worth of flowers. About 10 minutes after Sabrina had told everyone I ran nothing, the first course had still not appeared. The kitchen doors swung open hard enough to hit the stopper. Sabrina came through in her wedding gown with Caroline 2 steps behind her. Her smile was gone. Why isn't dinner going out? The banquet director answered before I could. We need the East Corridor reopened. I told you to use the other way. We can't run hot carts through the guest foyer during plated service. Sabrina looked at me. Her eyes narrowed. What did you do? I picked up my handbag from the shelf beside me. It was more instinct than theater. For one very brief second, I did consider walking out of the building and letting everybody figure out the rest of the night without me. Instead, I met her eyes. I gave you control. Her mouth tightened. You knew this would happen. Yes. And you just let me do it? I could hear Marcus go completely still behind me. You told a ballroom full of people I had no authority, I said. So I stopped using authority you said I didn't have. That's petty. No, Petty would be me stopping dinner. I didn't. I turned toward the banquet director. Did I tell you to stop service? No. Did I tell anyone to close that corridor? No. Sabrina looked at Caroline. Caroline lowered her tablet slightly. You confirmed the installation at 6:47. Sabrina's face changed. Not much. Just enough. She knew Caroline logged changes. My sister pointed toward the ballroom. Take it down. The florist was already being called. Marcus leaned closer to me. Say the word and I'll walk. I looked at him. No. Renee. 200 guests didn't do anything to me. Finish the event. He stared at me for another second, then nodded. Got it. 18 minutes after the scheduled launch, the corridor reopened and dinner started moving. No disaster. No screaming guests. No ruined food. The floral wall lost a section. Sabrina's photographs had one less perfect angle. And Hawthorne Hall continued operating exactly as it had been designed to operate. From the ballroom, most guests probably assumed the kitchen had been running late. Elena found me alone near the service corridor after the first carts rolled out. You knew closing it would stop service. Yes. And you let her close it? Yes. She folded her arms. How did that feel? I considered lying. For about 30 seconds, I said, wonderful. And after? Terrible. Elena nodded. Good. I looked at her. Good? Means you're still you. I laughed quietly. But the truth landed harder than the joke. I had enjoyed watching Sabrina discover that control had a cost. That part of me existed, and pretending otherwise would have been dishonest. But I also knew where my line was. I would let Sabrina own her decision. I would not punish guests, kitchen staff, servers, planners, or managers to make my point. That distinction would matter much more later. When I finally returned to the ballroom, Ryan was standing near the head table talking quietly with Sabrina. He was still in his tuxedo jacket, tie slightly loose, the way men look after spending an hour shaking hands with relatives they may never see again. I was close enough to hear him ask, was that the corridor they warned us about? Sabrina glanced toward me before answering. Renee turned it into a power play. Ryan frowned. I'm asking about the corridor. It's handled. He did not press her in front of the room. It was their wedding, and Ryan was not involved in our company. He simply looked from Sabrina to me, gave me a tired half-nod, and went back to helping the MC keep the evening moving. I appreciated that more than I would have appreciated some dramatic defense. I did not need my sister's husband fighting my family battles for me. My mother, unfortunately, had no such restraint. Susan found me near the edge of the dance floor after dinner started. Why didn't you warn her one more time? I stared at her. She was warned twice. You knew she was upset. And? She's your sister. There were few sentences in my childhood more dangerous than that one. Mom, Sabrina asked for control. She got control. You could have prevented a scene. There wasn't a scene until she came into the kitchen. My mother lowered her voice. You know what I mean. I did. I had known what she meant most of my life. Sabrina had feelings that needed protecting. I had abilities that needed using. Somehow, those two facts had always produced the same conclusion about which daughter should bend. Before I could answer, my father appeared. Victor Caldwell did not look angry. My father rarely showed anger first. He preferred disappointment, because disappointment made the other person do more work. We'll discuss this tomorrow, he said. Fine. His eyes stayed on me a moment longer. Not tonight. I wasn't planning to. That seemed to surprise him. Sabrina had already returned to the room wearing the bright, polished expression she used for clients, cameras, and relatives she did not particularly like. Within 10 minutes, she was laughing with bridesmaids again. Watching her, nobody would have guessed she had just stormed into a commercial kitchen, demanding to know why 200 dinners had disappeared. That was one of Sabrina's genuine talents. She could recover a room faster than almost anyone I knew. I was about to go check whether Elena needed anything else before speeches when I noticed my father near the windows at the far end of the ballroom. He was talking with Martin Hayes and Claire Donnelly. Martin was one of our independent directors. Claire represented the investment group that owned a significant minority stake in Caldwell Event Group. Both had been invited as longtime business contacts of the family. which was normal enough that I had not thought much about seeing them there. I would later wish I had paid closer attention much earlier. I was not trying to listen. I had simply stopped beside a table to move a misplaced champagne glass before a server caught it with a tray, and the three of them were close enough that part of my father's sentence carried over the music. One delay doesn't change what we discussed. Martin said something I could not hear. Then my father answered, "She's ready." I looked toward them. Claire had a champagne glass in one hand, and her attention entirely on Victor. My father continued, quieter this time, but I caught the last words. "After the wedding, we move." Martin glanced across the ballroom. For 1 second, his eyes landed on Sabrina. Then they moved to me. At the time, I did not know what my father meant. I did not know what had already been discussed, what exactly they planned to move on, or why a conversation about it apparently needed to wait until after my sister's wedding. I only knew one thing. Whatever Victor Caldwell was talking about, he had already decided someone was ready. And nobody had bothered to tell me for what. To understand why those words bothered me so much, you have to understand what my job looked like before Sabrina's wedding. 6 months earlier, nobody at Caldwell Event Group would have seriously claimed I ran nothing. They might have disagreed about how much authority I should have, and my family had developed some impressive gymnastics when it came to deciding who deserved credit, but the work itself was not invisible to the people doing it beside me. By that summer, Caldwell Event Group managed 5 event venues across the Nashville area, brought in roughly $55 million a year, and employed enough full-time and seasonal people that I could no longer remember every new hire's name on the first day. My title was Vice President of Operations. I had a good salary, executive benefits, performance bonuses, and enough authority that nobody needed to call my father every time a problem cost more than $1,000. I was not trapped in a basement doing unpaid labor for relatives who refused to acknowledge me. That would have been easier to recognize and easier to leave. A normal Monday in June could start with Hawthorne Hall reporting that a cooling unit in the West Ballroom was struggling, move to our downtown venue discovering that a rental company had double-booked lounge furniture for the weekend, and end with the finance team asking why labor costs at one property had jumped almost 9% in a month. Years earlier, I would have grabbed my phone and tried to solve all 3 myself. By 38, I had learned at least enough to know that was terrible leadership. I called Hawthorne's general manager and asked what the HVAC contractor had already tested, told procurement to give me 2 replacement rental options instead of a description of the problem, and sent the labor report back to Hannah with one question. Is this more hours, more expensive hours, or both? 40 minutes later, the cooling unit had a temporary repair scheduled. The furniture problem had 2 acceptable alternatives, and Hannah had found that the labor increase came from repeated last-minute agency staffing at one venue. My job was not knowing every answer. My job was making sure the right person could get to the answer before the problem became expensive. That was also why I liked the work. There was something satisfying about taking 5 buildings, hundreds of employees, dozens of vendors, and calendars full of weddings, fundraisers, conferences, galas, and corporate events, and making them behave like one coherent system. I liked measurable problems. A ballroom either held the number of guests the sales team promised or it did not. A staffing model either covered the event or it did not. A forecast either included the cost of the decision or somebody was pretending the cost would disappear. People sometimes assumed that because I was good at operations, I must have spent my days barking orders into a radio. Most days I spent more time asking questions than giving instructions. Elena Ruiz was usually the first person to remind me when I forgot that. She had been with the company almost a decade and ran venue operations with the kind of calm that made inexperienced managers think nothing ever surprised her. One afternoon, she walked into my office while I was rewriting a recovery plan one of our newer managers had sent me. She stood there long enough that I finally looked up. "What?" I asked. Elena pointed at my screen and said, "Is he dead?" I stared at her. "Who?" she said. "The manager whose work you're doing for him." I told her I was not doing his work. I was fixing the plan before he sent it to finance. Elena folded her arms, which is a very sophisticated way of doing his work. I leaned back in my chair. His plan has 3 assumptions that don't survive contact with arithmetic. Elena shrugged. Then send it back. I told her it would take me 10 minutes to fix. She answered, that sentence is how you ended up being everyone's emergency contact. I hated when Elena said something irritating and correct at the same time. I deleted the paragraph I had started rewriting, added 3 comments instead, and sent the document back to the manager. Elena gave me a satisfied nod. Look at that, growth. I told her to get out of my office. She left smiling. Marcus Reed had his own way of testing whether I meant what I said about people having lives outside the company. He had started with us as a banquet captain years earlier and worked his way into workforce and event operations because he could walk into a chaotic staffing situation and understand within minutes who was overwhelmed, who was underused, and who was pretending not to understand an assignment. One Tuesday, he stopped beside my desk and asked if he could block Thursday afternoons on his calendar for the foreseeable future. His father had started regular medical appointments, and Marcus was the one taking him. He began explaining that he could make up the hours on Fridays, move meetings, stay late on Wednesdays, and keep his phone on during the appointment. I stopped him halfway through. Block it recurring, I said. You don't owe me an explanation every Thursday. He hesitated and asked, what if something blows up? I told him. Then somebody else learns where the fire extinguisher is. Hannah Cole was harder because Hannah reminded me of myself at 30. She was our senior operations analyst, frighteningly good with numbers and completely capable of turning a minor variance into a personal moral failure. One night in July, I came back from a property meeting after 7 and found the light still on over her desk. She had 3 spreadsheets open, her hair pulled into a knot, and the expression of someone trying to intimidate Excel into confessing. Why are you still here? I asked. She did not look away from the screen. The Hawthorne numbers aren't finished. I told her they would still be numbers tomorrow. She finally looked up and said, you stay late. That isn't the argument you think it is, I said. She smiled because she knew she had caught me. I had spent years setting a standard I did not want anyone else copying. I went downstairs, found the cafe in our building 10 minutes from closing, bought the least depressing sandwich left in the case, and put it beside her keyboard. Eat that, send me whatever version exists at 8, and go home. Hannah looked at the sandwich, then at me. Are you going home at 8? I told her. We're discussing your bad choices right now. She laughed, and by 8:15, both of us were gone. Those relationships mattered because they were part of why I stayed. I did not wake up every morning suffering nobly for the Caldwell name. I had people I respected. I had a team that challenged me. I had a job that paid me well and gave me real responsibility. I also had enough equity-linked compensation and seniority that leaving was not something I treated casually. If my father had been a monster every day, my decision would have been simple. If Sabrina had been incompetent at everything, I would have stopped taking her seriously years earlier. The truth was more inconvenient. Sabrina was genuinely excellent at her job. In August, a luxury consumer brand was considering where to hold a 3-day leadership summit and product launch. Their team toured 2 of our properties but seemed ready to choose a newer competitor with more modern facilities. I looked at their requirements and saw a complicated event with expensive production demands and a difficult turnaround between sessions. Sabrina looked at the people. During the second walkthrough, she realized their chief marketing officer cared less about the ballroom than about keeping the executive team somewhere private enough that they would not spend 3 days being photographed by employees and guests. Sabrina stopped selling the largest venue and redirected them toward our smaller estate property, then built a proposal around privacy, controlled transportation, and exclusive access. She remembered that the executive's wife chaired an arts foundation and casually mentioned a local installation we could arrange as part of the opening reception. By the end of the week, they signed. I walked into Sabrina's office with the executed contract in my hand and said, "That was good." She looked offended. "Good? Very good. Thank you. I'll put that in a frame." I laughed and dropped the contract on her desk. You saw what they cared about before the rest of us did. Sabrina leaned back, pleased. Because you people keep selling buildings. People don't buy buildings. They buy the version of themselves they get to be inside them. That sounds expensive. It is. That's why they pay us. That was Sabrina at her best. She could read aspiration the way I read bottlenecks. She knew when a client wanted reassurance, when they wanted status, and when they wanted to feel as though an idea had been theirs all along. I never believed she contributed nothing to Caldwell Event Group. I believed something much narrower and, eventually, much more dangerous. Being exceptional at one part of leadership did not automatically make someone qualified to control every other part. Around the same time, our father began talking more openly about stepping back. Victor turned 65 that summer, and while he had no intention of disappearing to a golf course, he started saying he wanted fewer day-to-day decisions landing on his desk. For years, succession had existed as one of those family business subjects everyone knew was coming and nobody wanted to define. I had tolerated that when retirement was theoretical. Once Victor began using words like transition and next chapter in meetings, I decided ambiguity had become a business risk. I went into his office after a quarterly review in late August and closed the door. If you're serious about stepping back, we need a succession process. He looked amused. Good afternoon to you too. I'm serious. Sue and I. Then what's the process? Victor leaned back in his chair. Behind him was a framed photograph of the first Caldwell venue before the renovations, back when the company had been one building, 4 permanent employees, and a mortgage that kept my parents awake at night. Why are you in such a hurry? I'm not. That's why I'm asking before it becomes urgent. He smiled slightly. Always planning. That's literally what you pay me for. I asked whether the board would evaluate internal candidates, whether we planned an external search, what competencies mattered, and what timeline he expected. Victor listened, then gave me an answer that sounded reasonable until I thought about it for more than 5 seconds. After Sabrina's wedding, we'll sit down as a family. I stared at him. As a family? You know what I mean. I actually don't. President of Caldwell Event Group is a corporate position. And Caldwell Event Group is a family company, with outside investors and a board. His expression changed slightly. Not anger. A warning that I was pushing too hard. Renee, I built this company with the understanding that one day you girls would carry it forward. I'm not going to turn that conversation into some sterile interview process. I asked, then how are you deciding? He tapped one finger against his desk. After the wedding. It was not an answer. I knew it, and he knew I knew it. But I also knew enough about my father to understand that pushing harder that afternoon would only make him defend the ambiguity more fiercely. So I left his office with a decision he never knew I had made. I would give him until after Sabrina's wedding. If there was still no transparent process then, I would stop treating Caldwell Event Group as the only place my career could exist. That mattered a few weeks later when a recruiter named Allison Grant contacted me through LinkedIn. She worked with a national venue management company that had properties in multiple states and was building out its regional operations leadership. Her first message was not an offer. She asked whether I would be willing to have a confidential conversation. I nearly declined without taking the call. Then I remembered my father saying, as a family, and agreed to 20 minutes. Allison asked about venue count, team structure, operating margins, centralized procurement, and how much authority I actually held. She did not ask me to complain about my father or explain my family. That alone made the conversation feel strangely clean. Near the end, she said, I want to be clear. I'm not asking you to leave tomorrow. We don't even have the exact role I'd want to discuss finalized yet. I told her I was not actively looking. She said she understood. Then she added, if you ever want to know what your work is worth outside your last name, call me. I did not promise anything. I also did not delete her number. By September, wedding preparations were swallowing more and more of Sabrina's attention. She and Ryan were getting married at Hawthorne Hall in December, and because the venue belonged to our company, the normal line between bride and executive had become blurry. Sabrina tried not to interfere with staff, but she also knew everyone, which meant everyone knew how easily a casual preference from her could sound like an instruction from ownership. After one planning meeting produced 3 different versions of who could approve last-minute changes, Sabrina called me. "I need a favor. That sentence has never improved my day." "I'm serious." "So am I." She ignored me. "On the wedding day, I don't want Caroline bringing me every operational problem. If a vendor is late, if staffing gets weird, if something breaks, I want her to come to you." I frowned. "Define operational." "You know what operational means." "I know what it means. I want to know what you think it means." She sighed. "Building problem. Vendor problem. Staff problem. Something catches fire. I am not handling flowers. Fine. I'm not touching seating. Fine. I'm not settling family arguments. Please settle family arguments." "No." She laughed. "Fine. No family arguments." I made her repeat it because I knew us too well. "Operational emergencies only." "I am not becoming your shadow wedding planner." "Agreed. And if it is a bride decision, Caroline comes to you." "Agreed." "Then yes." Her whole face relaxed. "Thank you. That mattered to me too," she had asked. I had set a boundary. She had agreed to it. At that point, there was nothing unhealthy about the arrangement. My father happened to be passing my office when Sabrina left. He asked what she wanted, and I explained the agreement. Victor smiled with the kind of pride that had kept me working beside him through a lot of frustration. "You always know how to keep things moving." For years, I had treated that sentence like a compliment. Maybe it was one. The problem was that nobody ever asked who was supposed to move me. A few days later, Caroline sent the first version of the master wedding responsibility sheet to Sabrina, Ryan, the venue manager, and me. It was a routine document listing who had final say over different categories, so staff would not waste time chasing approvals on the wedding day. I skimmed it between meetings. Ryan was listed for several family and ceremony matters. Caroline handled planning coordination. The venue manager controlled building and safety decisions. Then I reached the section labeled Executive Decision Maker. Beside it was Sabrina Caldwell. Under Operations, Support was my name. I stared at those 2 lines longer than they deserved. Technically, nothing was wrong. It was Sabrina's wedding. She should have final authority over the choices that belonged to the client, and I had agreed to support operational emergencies. But something about the wording bothered me, especially after my conversation with Victor. Sabrina would make the decisions. I would keep the machinery underneath those decisions moving. At the time, I told myself I was reading too much into a wedding spreadsheet. 3 months later, standing in the kitchen while 200 dinners waited behind a floral wall my sister had chosen, I would remember those exact words. Executive Decision Maker. Operations Support. By October, I had started noticing how often my family turned competence into an obligation. The clearest example came during a Sunday dinner at my parents' house, when Sabrina complained that Caroline had copied me on another wedding logistics email. She was not angry enough to start a fight. She was irritated in the way people get when they believe a pattern is unfair, but have never stopped to examine how the pattern began. "I'm the bride," she said, pushing roasted potatoes around her plate. "Why does everybody keep checking with Renee?" I reminded her that she had personally asked Caroline to send operational problems to me. Sabrina said, "Operational problems, yes. Not every time somebody can't decide where to put a table." My mother gave the little sigh she used whenever she believed both daughters were making something more complicated than necessary. "Sabrina has always needed a little more reassurance," Mom said. "You know that, Renee. You were different. You could handle anything." I put down my fork. When did being able to handle something turn into volunteering? Mom smiled as though I had made a joke. "Oh, come on. You know what I mean." "I do. That's why I'm asking." Dad looked up from his plate but did not intervene. Sabrina leaned back and watched us, which irritated me more than if she had joined the argument. Mom reached for her water. "You were always the strong one. Even when you were little, you didn't need the same kind of attention." I could have turned that into a catalog of childhood grievances. I did not. I was 38 years old. Sitting in a house 15 minutes from my own with a career, savings, and a life that did not require my mother to apologize for decisions she had made when I was 12. But the sentence still landed because it explained something I had felt for years without naming. Sabrina's needs created obligations for everyone around her. My abilities apparently erased mine. I'm not asking you to rewrite our childhood, I said. I'm saying strength isn't consent. Mom frowned. Consent to what? To automatically taking the harder thing because everybody assumes I can. Dad finally spoke. Nobody is asking you to take anything tonight. I looked at him. That's not really the point. He gave me a patient smile. Then perhaps we can have dinner without turning this into a management seminar. Sabrina laughed softly. See, this is what I mean. Everything becomes a system with you. I looked across the table at her. Systems are useful. They show you who keeps getting the same job. For a moment, nobody answered. Then Mom asked Ryan whether his parents had finalized their hotel reservations, and the conversation moved on as smoothly as if mine had never happened. That was another Caldwell family skill. We could step around an uncomfortable truth so gracefully that an outsider might have mistaken it for good manners. The harder realization came at work 2 weeks later, because this time Sabrina was right. She had brought in a corporate client that wanted to add a second branded hospitality lounge to an event scheduled less than a week away. The client was important, the extra spend was substantial, and the idea itself was good. The problem was that Sabrina had told them we could add the lounge without changing their load-in time. By the time I heard about it, the production vendor needed another 4 hours for lighting and scenic installation. Hawthorne's service team needed access to the same corridor, and the fire inspection window had already been scheduled. I walked into Sabrina's office with the production schedule in my hand. Did you tell Mercer and Pine we could add the hospitality lounge without changing load-in? She looked up from her laptop. I told them we'd make it work. That is not the same sentence. They're spending another $80,000. I'm aware, and they don't want their executives arriving while crews are still setting up. I'm also aware of time. She closed her laptop. Then what's the problem? The problem is, the scenic vendor cannot build a second lounge in imaginary hours. Sabrina stood. I can talk to them. Already did. Her expression changed. You talked to the client? No, I talked to production. They can bring in a second crew, split the install, and start the lighting package through the north dock before the main load-in. It costs more, but we can absorb part of it from the additional event revenue. Mercer and Pine keeps the arrival time they were promised. She stared at me. So it's handled. Yes. Then why are you standing here? That was not the reaction I expected. Because I need you to stop promising operational changes before somebody confirms they're possible. I said I would have handled it. You didn't. I didn't get the chance. I almost laughed. Sabrina, the event is in 5 days. And I solved the problem. That's exactly my point. I stopped. She stepped around her desk. You say nobody trusts me with operations. You say Dad doesn't give me enough responsibility. But the second I make a decision you don't like, you run in and fix it before I can even finish. You made a promise you hadn't priced or scheduled. Yes, and I could have gone back to the client, or production, or both. You might have lost the upsell. I might have. That would have been my problem. It becomes my problem when operations has to deliver it. Sabrina shook her head. Everything becomes your problem because you make it your problem. I opened my mouth and then closed it. She saw that. You say nobody trusts me, she continued. You never let anyone finish anything. That's not fair, isn't it? I wanted to dismiss the entire conversation because she had created the original problem. She had promised first and checked feasibility second. That was exactly the kind of behavior I had spent years cleaning up. But being wrong about the promise did not make her wrong about what I did next. She had not asked me to take over. She had not refused to fix it. I had seen a risk, decided I could solve it faster, and removed the decision from her hands before she had a chance to own it. I still need you to check operational feasibility before making commitments, I said. Fine. And next time, I'll bring you the problem before I bring you the solution. She gave me a skeptical look. You say that like it physically hurts. It might. For the first time in several minutes, she smiled. Good. I left her office irritated with her, and even more irritated with myself. Elena noticed before lunch. I had told her what happened because the staffing adjustment affected one of her managers, and when I finished, she sat across from me with an expression I had learned to distrust. Don't, I said. I haven't said anything. You're about to. Elena folded her hands in her lap. You keep rescuing people who never ask what the rescue cost you. I stared at her. That sounded rehearsed. I've had 8 years. I did not rescue Sabrina. I prevented an event problem. Those can be the same thing. She overpromised. Yes. She created the issue. Yes. And somehow, I'm the problem. Elena shook her head. No, this is the part you hate. 2 things can be true. I leaned back. I hate this conversation. I know. She should have checked first. She should have. I should not have to let a client suffer so Sabrina can learn a lesson. You shouldn't. Then what exactly would you have done? Elena smiled. Asked her what she planned to do. That annoyed me because it was so simple. If her plan was bad, I asked, then you tell her why. And if she still makes the wrong decision? If it's inside her authority and nobody is in danger, maybe you let her own a bad decision. I looked through the glass wall of my office toward the operations floor. That sounds inefficient. It is. I hate inefficiency. I've noticed. I laughed despite myself. Elena leaned forward slightly. Renee, you're very good at making sure the building never catches fire. But sometimes you put out smoke before anyone else even smells it. Then you wonder why nobody learns where the extinguisher is. I knew she was right. Which did not mean I suddenly became a different person. The next time a manager sent me a poor plan, my first instinct was still to rewrite it. The next time Sabrina suggested an unrealistic turnaround, I still mentally redesigned the schedule before she finished speaking. Habits built over nearly 2 decades did not disappear because somebody delivered one clever metaphor before lunch. But I started asking one question more often. What are you planning to do about it? Sometimes the answer was better than I expected. That lesson followed me into the first full Hawthorne Hall wedding walkthrough in early November. Caroline was there with her tablet. The venue's banquet director joined us, and Sabrina had brought her florist because she wanted to see how the reception design would photograph from the ballroom entrance. Ryan attended the first half before leaving for a work call. I was there because Hawthorne belonged to Caldwell Event Group, and Sabrina had already designated me as the family-side operational emergency contact. My goal was simple. Identify anything that could become a problem on the wedding day, assign it to the correct owner, and resist the urge to personally adopt every loose thread in the building. The florist had designed a white floral installation to soften the view along the east side of the ballroom. On the rendering, it looked beautiful. In the building, it extended farther than the rendering suggested. I saw the issue as soon as the florist placed tape on the floor to mark the footprint. But this time, I did not immediately say no. I turned to the banquet director. How does that affect service? He walked over, looked at the tape, and shook his head. It can't stay like that during plated dinner. Sabrina looked at him. Why? That's our east service corridor. Hot cart stage from the kitchen through here. From 6:45 until roughly 8:15, I need the opening clear. The florist pointed toward the opposite side of the ballroom. Could they go through there? The banquet director shook his head again. That sends carts into the guest foyer. We don't run plated service through arriving or circulating guests. Sabrina looked at me. Is that actually a rule? I almost answered. Then I remembered Elena. I nodded toward the banquet director. His building during service. He said, it's standard operating procedure here. We can build the installation farther back or remove part of it before dinner. Sabrina studied the ballroom. But then you'll see the service door in the wide shots. Caroline said, we can adjust the camera angle. That changes the whole entrance. The florist suggested creating a movable section. The banquet director said that was fine, as long as his team had clear access before dinner launch. Sabrina was visibly unhappy, but there was nothing unreasonable about the restriction. Nobody was telling her she could not have flowers. Nobody was even telling her the installation could not exist. The venue was saying that for 90 minutes, food carts needed the route for which the building had been designed. Caroline entered a note on her tablet. Sabrina noticed. "What are you writing?" "Service corridor adjustment." "You're logging that?" Caroline glanced at me. I should have known that look would cause trouble. Sabrina laughed. "Of course you are. Renee probably wants a timestamp in case the roses testify against her." "I like timestamps." "I know you like timestamps. They're reliable. They're obsessive." I smiled. "Only the things people swear they never said." The banquet director laughed. Caroline did too. Sabrina rolled her eyes. But the note stayed in the system. The request was not marked as permanently denied because Sabrina still had options. It was simply documented. Proposed floral footprint obstructed East Service Corridor. Clear access required during plated dinner. Design, revision, pending bride and florist decision. At the time, it felt like one of 100 small planning details. That was the point of good documentation. You rarely knew which small detail would become important later. Hannah asked about my habit a few days afterward when she saw me add a written note to an internal approval record. "Do you seriously document everything?" she asked. "No, it feels like everything. I document decisions that affect money, people, safety, or somebody else's ability to pretend they never made the decision." She smiled. "That sounds specific." It is. Years earlier, one of our venues had approved a last-minute staffing reduction for a client trying to cut costs. Everyone involved remembered discussing it. Nobody remembered who had actually authorized it. When service went badly, 3 departments spent a week arguing over whose decision it had been. Nothing illegal happened. Nobody got fired. We simply wasted days reconstructing a conversation that should have taken 30 seconds to record. "So now everything gets a name and time?" Hannah asked. "Anything important enough to fight about later?" She nodded toward my screen. "That's depressing." "It's freeing." "How?" "Because memory gets emotional, records don't." I believed that completely. What I had not understood yet was how valuable those records became when the emotional people were also your relatives. By mid-November, Sabrina's wedding was consuming enough calendar space that I had begun protecting executive meetings around it. Victor had several board and investor conversations scheduled in December, and because major operational reviews required my presence, his executive assistant copied me on a scheduling chain, asking which dates I needed him available. There was nothing unusual about that. I was routinely included when finance, operations, or property decisions affected his calendar. I was working through the chain when one meeting title caught my attention: Post-Wedding Leadership Transition. The meeting was scheduled for the week after Sabrina returned from her short honeymoon. Martin Hayes was listed. Claire Donnelly was listed. General Counsel was listed. Victor obviously was listed. I was not. I read the title again. Then I read the attendee list again, because sometimes your brain tries to solve uncertainty by pretending the words might rearrange themselves. They did not. I forwarded the scheduling question to Victor's assistant with a neutral note. "Does this transition meeting affect operations planning or the January board calendar? I need to know whether to hold time for any follow-up sessions." Her answer came less than 10 minutes later. "Victor said no action needed from you right now. Family conversation comes first." I stared at that sentence. The wording was familiar because Dad had used almost the same phrase when I asked him directly about succession in August. After Sabrina's wedding, we would sit down as a family. I had accepted the delay even though I did not like it. I had told myself 3 months was not unreasonable when the founder of a family company was deciding how to step back from the business he had spent most of his adult life building. But now, there was a leadership transition meeting already on the calendar. It included an independent director. It included the representative of the investor group that owned roughly a third of our voting equity. It included counsel. And somehow the family conversation was still supposed to happen first. I did not know what Victor planned to propose. I did not know whether the meeting concerned his own retirement, a broader management restructuring, or something else entirely. I had no document telling me Sabrina was being considered for anything. At that point, assuming the whole plan would be about her would have been exactly that, an assumption. Still, I knew our company well enough to recognize the people around the table. Martin did not attend meetings because Dad wanted help choosing retirement hobbies. Claire did not block time because somebody wanted to discuss wedding photographs. General Counsel did not join conversations about who should carve the turkey at Christmas. I closed the email and tried to return to the operational forecast on my other monitor. For the next 20 minutes, I accomplished almost nothing. Elena eventually appeared at my door. "You're staring at the same cell." I'm thinking, that usually involves blinking. I looked up. Dad has a leadership transition meeting scheduled for after the wedding. She waited. "Martin. Claire. Counsel. And you?" "No." Elena's expression changed, but she did not tell me what it meant. That was another reason I trusted her. "Did you ask?" she said. "Yes." "What did they say?" "Family conversation comes first." Elena leaned against the doorframe. "Do you believe that?" I thought about my father's office in August. I thought about Sabrina's wedding responsibility sheet. I thought about my mother explaining that strong daughters needed less. Then I thought about Sabrina accusing me, correctly, of grabbing problems before anybody else had the chance to finish solving them. "I believe I'm done solving questions before I have the information," I said. Elena nodded. "That sounds healthy. Don't get excited." She smiled. "Wouldn't dream of it." I did not confront Victor that day. I did not call Claire. I did not start searching shared drives for documents I had no business opening. I put the meeting date on my own private calendar and kept doing my job. But something had changed. For years, when my family left a gap, I filled it. When someone failed to decide, I decided. When someone failed to prepare, I prepared twice as much. This time, I left the gap open, and I waited to see who intended to fill it. The meeting was called Post-Wedding Leadership Transition. Martin was invited, Claire was invited, General Counsel was invited. The woman currently responsible for operations across all 5 Caldwell venues was not. By 6:30 on the morning of Sabrina's wedding, Hawthorne Hall was already awake. Delivery vans were backed against the loading dock. Florists were carrying white roses through the side entrance, and somebody from the lighting company was standing on a ladder, arguing quietly with somebody from production about which dimmer panel belonged to whom. I arrived wearing jeans, sneakers, and a button-down shirt with my dress hanging in a garment bag over my shoulder because I knew better than to put on formal clothes before a venue finished trying to injure me. I had promised myself that day would be different. I was Sabrina's sister first, an executive only when something genuinely operational required me, and absolutely nobody's unpaid wedding coordinator. Caroline found me before I made it 20 feet inside. Her face had that careful expression planners develop when they are trying not to let a bride know the morning has already produced a problem. "The rental company is missing 12 cocktail tables," she said. "They say the truck was loaded correctly." I asked whether they had checked the secondary truck scheduled for the garden furniture. She had not. I told her to check there first, and if the tables were not on it, call procurement because we had compatible inventory at another Caldwell property less than 40 minutes away. Then I kept walking. 5 minutes later, she texted me that the tables were on the second truck. That was exactly the kind of question I had agreed to handle. It had a clear operational answer, required no opinion about flowers or dresses, and did not involve deciding whether Uncle Peter should be moved away from someone he had not spoken to since the previous Thanksgiving. The second issue was equally ordinary. A vendor had parked where the catering delivery needed access, so I asked one of Hawthorne's managers to have the vehicle moved. I did not move it myself, call the vendor personally, or turn the whole thing into a demonstration of how quickly Renee Caldwell could fix a parking problem. I was trying. My mother tested that effort around 9. Susan appeared beside me while I was checking a text from Elena and said, "The place cards at table 12 need to be changed." I looked up. "Why?" "Aunt Marianne wants to sit with the Hendersons." "That sounds like a Caroline problem." "Caroline is busy. So am I." Mom frowned. "It would take you 2 minutes." I slipped my phone into my pocket. And then changing table 13 will take 2 minutes. And finding a seat for whoever Marianne displaced will take 2 minutes. And by lunch, I'll be managing the seating chart I specifically said I wasn't managing. René. Mum. She stared at me, waiting for the old mechanism to engage. Normally, her disappointment would have produced a small surge of guilt, and I would have decided doing the task was easier than explaining why I should not have to do it. That morning, I smiled instead and pointed across the ballroom. Caroline's assistant is standing right there. She has the seating file. Mom gave me the look she reserved for moments when I was technically being reasonable in a way she found emotionally inconvenient. Then she walked away. I watched her approach Caroline's assistant and felt ridiculous for how satisfying such a tiny boundary was. Ryan arrived with his groomsmen late that morning and disappeared almost immediately into the normal chaos of a groom's wedding day. His parents needed something from their hotel. One of his friends had forgotten cufflinks. The photographer wanted the men outside while the light was still good. He had attended the planning meetings that affected him, but Ryan did not work for Caldwell Event Group and never pretended to understand our operations. When Caroline asked him whether the kitchen should move dinner service by 10 minutes because photographs were running behind, he looked at her and said, "That sounds like a venue question, not a groom question." I liked him for that. Sabrina was different. She had spent a year telling everyone she wanted to be treated like a bride rather than an executive, but on the wedding day those identities kept colliding. A florist asked whether a display could be shifted, and Sabrina knew exactly which employee normally approved room layout changes. A bartender mentioned a delivery issue, and she knew the vendor contract. Every time she tried to step out of the business recognized her anyway. Every time she tried to enjoy being the bride, somebody remembered she was Victor Caldwell's daughter. By early afternoon, I could see the strain behind her makeup. She was sitting in the bridal suite while one of her bridesmaids adjusted the edge of her veil when Caroline came in with the florist. I was there because Sabrina had asked me to bring up a small box our mother had left in the office downstairs. I should have handed over the box and walked out. Instead, the florist said the words "East Corridor," and every operational instinct I had turned around before the rest of me could leave. "We adjusted the installation," she said. "But Sabrina wants to extend the lower section after the ceremony." Sabrina looked at me immediately. "It photographs better." I did not answer. She waited. "Well?" I turned to the banquet director, who had followed them into the room. "Your service." He nodded. "Same restriction as the walkthrough. If the extension blocks the east corridor, it has to be removed before plated dinner." Sabrina exhaled. "But if you remove it, there's a gap in the wall. For about 90 minutes, which is when everybody will be in the ballroom." Caroline said they could adjust the photographer's position. The florist suggested a lighter, movable section. I kept my mouth shut because this was precisely the kind of situation Sabrina had accused me of taking over. She had options. None of them threatened safety. None of them required me to decide for her. She finally said, "Leave the lower section off for now. We'll decide before reception." Caroline entered the change into her tablet. Sabrina caught the movement. "Another timestamp?" Caroline smiled carefully. Sabrina looked at me. "You really have trained everyone." "I didn't train Caroline. You know what I mean." "I usually do." She shook her head, but she was smiling when I left. At the time, I thought the moment had gone better than it might have. She had asked a question, received the operational constraint from the person responsible for enforcing it, and chosen a temporary solution. That was how decisions were supposed to work. An hour later, I changed into my dress and tried to stop being vice president of operations. For almost 40 minutes, I succeeded. I stood beside my mother while Sabrina walked down the aisle. I watched Ryan's expression change the second he saw her, and whatever resentments existed between my sister and me became temporarily irrelevant. Sabrina looked beautiful, but more importantly, she looked happy. When she reached Ryan, she laughed quietly because he was already blinking too hard. And I found myself laughing with her. There are moments when family history becomes very small. Watching my little sister get married was one of them. At the reception, however, Caldwell Event Group came back through the door before I did. Caroline approached me during cocktails because one rental delivery had been delayed. I gave her the simplest operational answer and returned to my conversation. Later, she came back because the photographer's equipment case was partly blocking a service door. Again, it was a question I could resolve in less than a minute. I did not notice Sabrina watching until Martin Hayes joined the conversation. Martin had known our father for years, but he had also spent enough time on our board to understand that Victor and I approached business very differently. He had a dry sense of humor and the unfortunate habit of saying things that were accurate enough to become dangerous. Caroline had just thanked me for answering her question when Martin glanced across the room towards Sabrina and smiled. "Looks like your sister's running the whole place." I knew immediately that the joke had landed badly. Sabrina's smile remained in place, but her eyes changed. "She doesn't run anything," she said. "Send her to the kitchen." The people closest to us went quiet. I could have laughed it off. I could have told Martin exactly what my title was. I could have reminded Sabrina that she had asked for my help herself. Instead, I looked at Caroline and thought about the conversation in Sabrina's office when she accused me of never letting anybody finish anything. "Give her exactly what she asked for," I said. Caroline understood faster than almost anyone else would have. Bride decisions went to the bride. Operational rules stayed with the venue. I was no longer acting as the informal bridge between those two things. I walked into the service area before my temper could convince me that staying in the ballroom was somehow dignified. Marcus saw me first. He held out a paper cup. "Decaf." I took it and looked at him. "That is not coffee." "It's after 6. "Exactly. We still have problems." 9. I counted 11. Elena fixed one. I looked toward Elena, who was checking something on her radio. Marcus lowered his voice. "I lied about the other." Elena looked up. "He means I fixed both." I smiled despite myself. Marcus watched me more closely. "You okay?" "Fine." That was convincing. "Thank you." He leaned one shoulder against the wall. "Your sister's wedding has somehow turned into your quarterly review with flowers. That obvious?" Elena answered before he could. "To everyone except your family." The line hurt because she said it gently. I took a drink of the decaf and made a face. "This really is terrible." Marcus nodded. "Focus on what matters." Then Caroline came through the doors. "Renee, the florist is asking again about the East Corridor." She stopped herself almost immediately. I said nothing. "Right," she said. "Bride." She went back out. Marcus looked toward the doors. "What was that?" "Something Sabrina needs to decide." He waited for more. I gave him none. What happened next took less than 10 minutes. Caroline later showed me the change record because there was an incident report to complete. At 6:47, Sabrina confirmed that she wanted the floral installation extended to cover the service side opening. The florist finished the lower section. At 6:58, the banquet director found the east corridor obstructed and placed plated service on hold. Nobody panicked. Past appetizers were still circulating. The kitchen maintained proper holding temperatures. Servers remained in position. The only thing not happening was the first course leaving the staging area. The banquet director came out and told Elena, "East corridor is closed." Elena asked, "Approved by?" "Bride through planner." Then he looked at me. For years, that look had been enough. Somebody would make a bad decision, the consequences would appear, and the room would turn toward Renee. I nodded toward his radio. "Follow venue procedure." He did. Several minutes later, the kitchen doors opened hard and Sabrina came through with Caroline behind her. Her wedding dress made the service hallway suddenly look much narrower. "Why isn't dinner going out?" the banquet director told her. I said, "Use the other side. We can't run hot carts through the guest foyer during plated service." "Then what are we supposed to do?" "Reopen the east corridor." Her eyes found me. "What did you do?" By then, I had picked up my handbag from the shelf where I had left it. I was angry enough to leave, but not reckless enough to abandon an event while my team was responsible for it. I looked at Sabrina and said the only thing that felt completely accurate. "I gave you control. You knew this would happen." "Yes. And you let me do it?" "You told everyone I had no authority. So I stopped using authority you said I didn't have." Her face flushed. "That is unbelievably petty." "No, Petty would be me ordering dinner stopped because you embarrassed me. I didn't. I looked at the banquet director. Did I tell you to stop dinner? No. Did I approve closing the corridor? No. Caroline raised her tablet slightly. You confirmed the installation at 6:47, Sabrina. My sister stared at the screen. For once, nobody had to remember what happened. The record already did. Sabrina turned toward Caroline. Take the flowers down. The florist and venue team removed the obstructing section. Ryan stayed in the ballroom while the delay was corrected. And when Caroline briefly explained what had happened, he did not come into the kitchen to fight with anybody. He asked how quickly the route could be restored and whether the guests needed to be told anything. Caroline said the delay was minor and service would resume shortly. He told her to fix the route and keep the evening moving. Dinner launched roughly 18 minutes late. That should have been the end of it. Instead, my mother found me after service began and asked why I had not warned Sabrina one more time. My father told me we would discuss my behavior the following day. Sabrina spent the rest of the evening acting as if the kitchen confrontation had been a minor inconvenience caused by someone else. I watched all three of them return to normal with a speed I suddenly found fascinating. They were not denying what had happened. They were rearranging responsibility. That night, I also heard my father talking with Martin and Claire near the windows. One delay doesn't change what we discussed, he said. Then came the sentence I had carried home with me. She's ready. The next morning, Sunday, December 7th, I woke before 7 despite going to bed after midnight. I made coffee and stood barefoot in my kitchen while my phone charged on the counter. My head hurt slightly, not from alcohol, but from the kind of exhaustion that comes from being angry for too many hours without deciding what to do with it. I had no intention of calling Sabrina. I had no intention of calling my father either. For once, I wanted them to come to me. At 7:23, my work phone lit up with an email from General Counsel. The subject line read, Key Executive Retention Agreement. I opened it at the kitchen counter. The first page was ordinary enough. Caldwell Event Group was preparing for a planned expansion facility connected to 2 venue acquisitions. The lender wanted management continuity during the integration period. I had known financing was being discussed, although I had not seen final terms. The proposed agreement asked me to remain with Caldwell Event Group for 3 years following closing. There was additional compensation. A retention bonus. It was not an insulting offer. If anything, the money made one thing clear, immediately. They knew exactly how important my role was. I kept reading. Counsel's cover note said the lender required the continuity commitment to be executed before final credit approval. Nothing had been represented as complete, because nothing was complete yet. They needed my review. Then I reached the appendix. I stopped drinking my coffee. There was a proposed leadership structure for the post-transition company. At the top was one name, President, Sabrina Caldwell. Below it was mine, Senior Vice President, Operations, Renee Caldwell. I read it twice. Then I saw the line beneath the chart, Operational continuity dependent on retention of Renee Caldwell. For several seconds, I simply stood there, with my hand resting against the kitchen counter. The meeting invitation I had seen weeks earlier came back to me. Post-wedding leadership transition. Martin, Claire, counsel. Not me. My father's words from the reception returned next. She's ready. After the wedding, we move. I had spent months asking what the succession process would be. My father had told me we would discuss it as a family. But there it was in front of me, attached to a financing package serious enough that lawyers and lenders were already building around it. My sister had been selected to lead the company, and apparently the plan only worked if I agreed to stay underneath her and make sure it kept running. I read the retention package 3 times before I called anyone. The first time, I read it as an employee. The second time, I read it as an executive. The third time, I read it as a woman whose father had apparently planned the next 3 years of her life without asking whether she wanted to live them. The distinction mattered because there was nothing obviously abusive about the document itself. My base salary would increase. My annual incentive target would improve. And there was a substantial retention bonus divided across the 3-year period. If I had received the same offer after an open conversation about succession, I might have considered it seriously. The lender language was equally clear. Caldwell Event Group was pursuing financing connected to the acquisition of 2 additional event properties, and final credit approval depended in part on continuity within senior management. The lender wanted a signed retention commitment from me before closing. The agreement was not executed. Counsel had not pretended otherwise, and nothing in the package suggested the bank believed I had already signed. From a financing perspective, the process was exactly where it should have been. Proposed structure, requested commitment, employee review. The problem was not the lender. The problem was that everybody seemed to have designed the structure before anybody remembered to ask the employee. I kept returning to the organizational chart. President: Sabrina Caldwell. Senior Vice President, Operations: Renee Caldwell. My sister moved up. I stayed almost exactly where I was, except with more money and 3 additional years attached to my name. Below the chart, the phrase operational continuity dependent on retention of Renee Caldwell remained almost insulting in its honesty. I had spent years wondering whether my father understood what I contributed. There was my answer. He understood well enough to build financing around it. That realization hurt more than being overlooked would have. I did not call Victor first because I knew myself. If I heard his voice while I was still standing barefoot in my kitchen with that document open, I would either say too little or too much. Neither was useful. I showered, got dressed, printed the package, and drove to my parents' house because my mother had already texted, asking whether I wanted to come by for leftover wedding brunch food. I told myself I was going, because Susan might know how much of this had already been discussed inside the family. I was not going for comfort. Mom was in the kitchen wearing leggings and one of Dad's old Vanderbilt sweatshirts when I walked in. The house looked like the morning after a wedding always does. Gift bags covered one end of the dining table. Somebody had brought home 3 arrangements of white flowers, and half the refrigerator was occupied by containers. Nobody in that house would finish. Mom took one look at the folder under my arm and said, "Victor told me you'd probably come by." That was not a promising beginning. "You know about this." She dried her hands. "About what exactly?" I placed the succession chart on the counter between us. Mom looked down at it, then back up at me. She did not look surprised. "How long?" I asked. "Renee, how long have you known Dad was preparing Sabrina to become president?" She pulled out a chair. "Sit down. I'm fine standing." "That means you're angry." "I am angry," Mom sighed. "Your father has been talking about different possibilities for months. Different possibilities that somehow became a financing package. It isn't final. My name is in it. Because you're important to the company. That is not the reassuring statement you think it is." Mom looked toward the hallway as if checking whether Dad was home. He was not. She lowered her voice anyway. "Sabrina needs the title more than you do." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood her. "What?" "You heard me. I'm hoping I didn't." Mom's expression tightened. "Please don't make this crueler than it is. Your sister has spent years feeling as though nobody takes her seriously inside the business. You have never had that problem." I stared at her. "Mom, this is the presidency of a $55 million company, not the last piece of birthday cake. I know exactly what it is." "Then why are you talking about who needs it emotionally?" "Because families are made of people, Renee, not resumes. And companies are made of responsibilities." Mom walked around the counter and sat across from me. "Your father believes you and Sabrina balance each other. She is good with clients. She brings opportunities into the company. You understand the internal side better than anyone. Why is that an insult?" "Because nobody asked me whether I wanted to spend the next 3 years making sure her presidency works. You already lead operations." "That's not the point. You're being offered more money." "That's still not the point." Mom looked frustrated. "Then tell me what the point is." I pushed the chart toward her. "The point is authority. The point is that Dad told me there would be a succession process after the wedding, while he was already designing one with Martin, Claire, Counsel, and apparently Sabrina. The point is that this plan depends on me. but I was the last person invited into it. Mom shook her head. You've never needed applause. This isn't applause. It's authority. She went quiet. I had expected her to defend Sabrina. I had not expected her to reveal how completely my family confused recognition with vanity whenever I asked for it. In Mom's mind, I already possessed the meaningful thing because everyone trusted me to solve problems. Wanting the title, the vote, or the authority attached to those responsibilities seemed almost superficial. Sabrina wanted recognition, so Mom believed recognition belonged to Sabrina. I had competence, so competence should be enough for me. And what do I need? I asked. Mom looked at me. I waited. She opened her mouth, then closed it. That silence told me more than the rest of the conversation. Dad called 40 minutes later and asked me to meet him at the office Monday morning. His tone was calm, almost warm. He did not apologize for the chart, and I did not ask him to over the phone. I spent Sunday evening making a list of questions because I knew that if I walked into his office carrying only hurt, Victor would turn the conversation into an argument about feelings. I wanted facts. At 9 the next morning, I sat across from the same desk where I had asked him about succession in August. He gestured toward the retention package. Good offer. The money is good. I thought you'd see that. I also saw the chart. Victor leaned back. Then we can save some time. I studied his face. Were you ever planning an actual succession process? This is the process. No, this is a decision. It's a proposal to the board. A proposal you developed without the executive whose retention the proposal depends on. You're here now. That is an astonishing answer. He exhaled. Renee, I'm not trying to insult you. I know. That made him pause. I don't think you're trying to insult me, I continued. I think you genuinely believe this makes sense. So explain it. He folded his hands on the desk. Sabrina brings people in. You make sure we keep them. That explains our current jobs. It explains your strengths. It does not explain why her strength leads to president and mine leads to staying exactly where I am. You would not be exactly where you are. We're increasing your scope, compensation, and incentive participation. Still reporting into Sabrina. In the proposed structure, yes. Why? Victor gave me the look he used when a discussion had gone on longer than he believed necessary. Because I know both of you. That isn't an answer. It is the answer. I don't need an outside consultant to tell me what my daughters are good at. I never asked for an outside consultant. You asked for some formal competition. I asked for a process. And I'm telling you I've spent years watching both of you work. I leaned forward. Then what did you evaluate? Everything. That means nothing. Client growth, operations, staff retention, financial performance, leadership. And your conclusion was Sabrina. My conclusion was that the company needs both of you. Then why does only one of us get the top job? His jaw tightened slightly. Because organizations need one president. Exactly. For the first time, irritation surfaced in his voice. You are turning this into a contest when it doesn't need to be one. It became a contest when you assigned one of us authority over the other. She is not being given authority because I love her more. I didn't say that. You're implying favoritism. I'm asking you to explain your decision. Victor stood and walked toward the window. It was something he did when he wanted to reset a conversation on his terms. Behind him, downtown Nashville was gray with December rain. Sabrina has spent years building relationships this company depends on, he said. She has brought in national clients. She understands how the market is changing. She can walk into a room with people who have never heard the Caldwell name and make them want to work with us. All true. You say that like there's a but. There is. None of that tells me she can run the whole company. She doesn't need to personally run every department. Neither would I. She'll have you. There it was. 3 words. He said them casually enough that I almost missed how much they contained. She'll have me, I repeated. Victor turned. You know what I mean. I think I finally do. You are the best operations executive we've ever had. It should have felt good to hear my father say it. Instead, something cold settled in my stomach. If Sabrina becomes president, I said slowly, who replaces me in operations? You're not leaving operations. That's not what I asked. If I became president, who replaces me? Victor said nothing. Who? We would have to recruit. Internally or externally? Probably both. How long? I don't know. 6 months, maybe longer. And Sabrina's brand role? He frowned. What about it? If she becomes president, who replaces her? That's easier. The words left his mouth before he had time to soften them. I sat back. Victor knew it too. He walked toward the desk. That came out wrong. No, it didn't. René, that was probably the most honest answer you've given me. You're twisting it. I'm not twisting anything. You just told me replacing me would be difficult and replacing Sabrina would be easier. That doesn't mean she's less valuable. I didn't say it did. Then what exactly are you accusing me of? I looked at him. Did you ever think I couldn't do the job? His expression changed. Not much. Enough. President, I said, did you ever think I couldn't do it? Of course you could. I had spent years thinking that question would matter. I had imagined some version of my father saying I lacked vision, charisma, financial experience, or whatever quality he believed Sabrina possessed that I did not. I thought, if I knew the objection, I could evaluate whether it was fair. Maybe I would agree. Maybe I would not. Either way, at least the problem would have a name. Instead, he had never doubted me. Then why not me? Victor sat down again. Because I need you where you are strongest. I almost laughed. There was the competence tax in its purest form. He continued, believing he was explaining something reasonable. René, transitions are risky. We're talking about adding 2 properties. We have financing conditions. We have managers who trust you. Vendor relationships run through your division. The smartest thing I can do is keep the strongest operator in operations while giving Sabrina room to grow into broader leadership. Under my supervision? Not supervision. But with me catching whatever she misses? That is not what I said. It's what the structure says. You're acting like Sabrina is incompetent. I have never said she's incompetent. Then stop treating this like I'm putting a child in charge. I'm treating it like you chose a president partly because you expect another executive to make the choice safe. He stared at me. I could see the argument he wanted to make because I had made versions of it myself. Good leaders built teams around their weaknesses. Presidents did not personally perform every function. There was nothing inherently wrong with Sabrina leading, while a stronger operations executive handled operations. The problem was consent. A structure could be strategically sound and still be built dishonestly. You could have asked me, I said. Victor's voice softened. And risk you walking away before we had everything lined up? That sentence stayed between us. I felt something shift. Was that a concern? Of course it was. Why? Because you take these things personally. I stared at him. You thought if you told me you were choosing Sabrina, I might leave. I thought you might react emotionally before understanding the whole plan. So, instead, you built a financing package that depends on me staying. It gives you every reason to stay. No, it gives me money to agree after the decision has already been made. Victor rubbed his forehead. You're almost 40 years old. I'm not bribing you to stay home for Christmas. This is an executive retention package. Companies do this every day. Yes, usually the executive knows what they're being retained for. You know now, and I know because counsel sent me paperwork. Not because my father respected me enough to have the conversation first. His face hardened. Be careful. With what? With turning a business disagreement into some indictment of me as a father. You're the one who told me the succession process would be a family conversation. That conversation is happening. No, you made the decision as a businessman and waited to sell it to me as a father. He stood again. This time I did too. I did not cry. I did not tell him he had always loved Sabrina more. I did not demand he give me the presidency to prove my value. Standing there, I realized I did not even know whether I wanted the job anymore. What I knew was that I wanted the right to decide what responsibilities I accepted. I'm not signing anything today, I said. Nobody asked you to. Good. You have time to review it. I will. He gave a short nod. Then review it. I picked up my folder. As I reached the door, he said, René. I turned. Sabrina needs room to grow. I looked at him for a moment. then let her grow. He seemed relieved until I finished. Just stop assuming I'm the soil. I left before he could answer. Sabrina called that afternoon. I considered letting it go to voicemail, then decided avoiding her would only delay a conversation I needed to have. She opened with, "Dad said you're upset." Dad has a gift for understatement. She was quiet for a second. "Can we talk?" We met at a coffee shop halfway between my office and hers, because neither of us wanted the conversation inside Caldwell Event Group. Sabrina arrived 10 minutes late wearing sunglasses on top of her head and carrying 2 phones, one personal and one company-issued. She sat down across from me and studied my face as if trying to decide which version of her older sister had shown up. "I didn't know they were sending you the agreement Sunday morning," she said. "That is not the part I'm interested in." She lowered her eyes. I figured, "How long have you known?" "About what?" "The proposed president role." She looked toward the window. "Sabrina, 2 weeks." I had prepared myself for months. 2 weeks somehow made me angrier. "Before the wedding?" "Yes. Before you stood in a ballroom and told everyone I ran nothing." Her face tightened. "Those things were not connected." "I didn't say they were. You're making it sound like I planned some public humiliation because I knew Dad was making me president." "Did you?" "No." I believed her. Not because I suddenly trusted everything she said, but because Sabrina had never been particularly good at hiding the emotional motive behind a bad decision. The wedding comment had been spontaneous. Martin's joke had hit an insecurity, and she had lashed out. That did not excuse it. It simply meant the succession plan had not been a months-long conspiracy designed by my sister. "What did Dad tell you?" I asked. "That he wanted to recommend me." "To the board?" "Yes." "And me?" Sabrina took a breath. "He said you wanted to stay in operations." I stared at her. "He said what?" "He said you didn't want the politics of president, that you liked running the actual business." Did that sound like something I would say? You complain about executive politics constantly. I also complained that nobody would tell me what the succession process was. She looked uncomfortable. "What else?" "He said you would stay through the expansion." "Did he say I agreed?" He made it sound settled. "Sabrina, did you ask me?" She looked at me. "That was the answer. You knew the plan depended on me staying under you for 3 years, and you never asked whether I wanted to do that." What was I supposed to say? "Hey, Renee, Dad might make me president. Are you okay with being my operations person?" That would have been a start. You would have hated me. "I'm not thrilled with you now." She leaned back. Anger replacing discomfort. "You think Dad chose me because I'm stupid?" "No, because that's what this feels like. Everyone keeps talking about how important it is that you stay, like I'm some idiot he's trying to prop up. I don't think you're an idiot. Then why are you acting like the whole company dies if I get promoted?" "I'm not." "You practically said it to Dad." "I said he designed the plan around my staying." "Because you run operations." "Exactly. That's your job, and president would be yours." Sabrina crossed her arms. "You think I can't do it?" I looked at her. She had spent years believing I saw her as less serious than I saw myself. Sometimes I had, not because she was unintelligent, but because I knew how often the glamorous promise arrived in my department after she had already sold it. I also knew how often my reflex was to solve the problem before she could. So I gave her the most honest answer I had. "No. I think Dad chose you because he knows I'll keep the company alive." Her face went completely still. It was crueler than I intended. Maybe part of me intended it anyway. "You really believe that?" she said. "I believe Dad just told me replacing me in operations would be harder than replacing you in brand." Something flickered across her face. Hurt, then anger. "So that's it." "What?" "You finally got him to say you're more important." "That is not what happened." "It's exactly what happened. You've been waiting your whole life for him to admit you're the competent one." "Sabrina, stop." "No, you want to talk about honesty? Let's be honest. You like being the person everybody needs." I felt my jaw tighten. She leaned forward. "You complain about fixing everything, but you never let anyone else finish failing." I looked away. She saw that too. "Mercer and Pine," she said. "I made a promise you didn't like, and before I had a chance to fix it, you fixed it for me." The wedding corridor? You knew what would happen and stood there waiting for me to screw up. You don't trust anybody else to make mistakes, because you need to be the person standing there with the answer. You're using two completely different situations. Are they? Yes. At the wedding, you publicly told me I had no authority after asking me to handle operational problems for you. And you loved proving what happened when you stopped. For 30 seconds, yes. That surprised her. I continued before she could answer. I'm not pretending I'm perfect. I should have let you solve Mercer and Pine. I've spent years stepping in too fast, but that doesn't give Dad the right to assign me 3 more years of doing it without asking. Sabrina looked down at her coffee. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, I want the job. I know. I think I can do it. Then you should be able to say that without needing me trapped underneath you. Her eyes came up. I'm not asking Dad to take the recommendation away from you, I said. I'm not asking him to give it to me. I'm asking one thing. Stop treating my future as part of your succession package. Sabrina's voice was quieter when she answered. I didn't build the package. No. And I didn't tell the lender you were staying. I know. That was important. Anger did not make me entitled to invent crimes. She rubbed her thumb along the cardboard sleeve around her cup. Dad said the board knew. Knew what? That you'd stay. I stopped. She looked at me cautiously. What exactly did he say? I don't remember the exact words. 3. He said Martin and Claire were comfortable because operations continuity was handled. Handled how? He said you were committed to seeing the expansion through. My stomach tightened. Sabrina, I haven't committed to anything. She frowned. I assumed you had. Why? Because Dad told me you had. I held her eyes. There was no satisfaction in her face now. Only confusion. Then she said the sentence that changed the direction of everything that followed. Dad told the board you'd already agreed to stay. I did not accuse Victor of lying to the lender. I had the package in front of me, and counsel's language was clear that my signature was still pending. But internal expectations were something else entirely. If Victor had told directors and executives I was committed before I had even seen the terms, I needed to know exactly what had been said, to whom, and in what form. I left Sabrina at the coffee shop and drove back to the office. I did not go to my father. I went to general counsel. I put the unsigned retention agreement on the conference table and said, I need this formally noted. I have not consented to remain through the expansion, and I am not executing this agreement under the current deadline. Counsel did not argue. She asked whether I was rejecting the offer permanently. I said I was not making a permanent employment decision that afternoon. I was making one very specific decision. Nobody was authorized to represent that I had agreed to 3 years when I had not. She nodded and wrote it down. The lender will continue to see retention as pending, she said. If you ultimately decline, financing will have to be reassessed. That's fine. It may affect timing. I understand. You're comfortable with that? I thought about the 2 acquisitions. I thought about the hundreds of people who worked for Caldwell Event Group. I thought about how easily guilt could turn a request into an obligation if I let everyone else decide what consequences belong to me. I'm comfortable telling the truth, I said. Counsel gave me a long look, then nodded. I'll document your position. That was all. No dramatic threat. No explosion. No revenge plan. I returned to my office, closed the door, and sat behind the desk where I had solved thousands of problems for Caldwell Event Group. Then I opened my personal phone. Allison Grant's contact was still there. The recruiter who had told me months earlier that if I ever wanted to know what my work was worth outside my last name, I should call. I did not call her yet. But for the first time, I opened our old message thread and read it from the beginning. My father had spent months deciding where he needed me. I was finally beginning to ask where I wanted to be. The first official argument after I refused to sign the retention agreement was not about succession. It was about 18 minutes at my sister's wedding. Sabrina had returned from her short honeymoon. Hawthorne Hall's banquet director had completed his incident report, and Caroline's final event file was ready for internal review. Victor called the 3 of us into a conference room the Monday before Christmas and opened with a sentence that told me exactly what he wanted the record to say. We need to put the wedding communication failure behind us. I looked at the draft report in front of him and asked, which communication failed? He gave me a tired look. "Renee, please." I turned the document toward myself. The draft described the dinner delay as a breakdown between event planning and operations, with no decision owner attached to the corridor closure. Sabrina sat across from me with her arms folded. "You stood there knowing exactly what would happen." I looked at her. "Yes." She seemed surprised. I admitted it so easily. "And you don't think that belongs in the report?" I said. "If you want to add that I understood Hawthorne's service protocol, absolutely. We can also add that the protocol had been explained during the walkthrough. The floral installation was approved at 6:47. The banquet director found the corridor obstructed at 6:58, and service resumed after the installation was removed." Victor leaned back and said, "This is exactly what I don't want. A family disagreement turning into a forensic exercise." I told him, "Then don't write a report. But if we are writing one, it needs to describe what happened." Caroline joined by video because she was already back with another client. She pulled up the changelog without drama. The first entry showed the corridor restriction from the November walkthrough. Another showed Sabrina choosing to leave the lower floral section off until reception. Then came the final approval on the wedding day. Bride confirmed installation extension at 6:47 p.m. The banquet director's report showed plated service paused 11 minutes later because the east corridor no longer met the venue's service flow requirement. There was no instruction from me to stop dinner, no message from me to the florist, and no secret coordination with Hawthorne's staff. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. Sabrina stared at the screen. "That doesn't change the fact that she knew." I said, "I have never denied knowing." She looked at Victor. "Do you hear how she says that?" Victor rubbed one hand across his chin. "Renee, you could have intervened." I answered, "I could have." Sabrina could also have followed the rule she had already been given twice. He said, "And because she didn't, you let 200 guests wait for dinner." I kept my voice even. "No. Hawthorne followed its safety and service procedure for 18 minutes while the obstruction was removed. Past appetizers continued. Food stayed in holding. Nobody lost a meal. If you want a sentence saying I chose not to override the bride's documented decision after she publicly told everyone I had no authority, put that sentence in too." For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then Victor said the thing I had expected from the beginning. "I am trying to keep this from becoming ammunition." I asked, "For whom?" His eyes narrowed. "Anyone." I shook my head. "I'm not sending this to staff. I'm not posting it. I'm not showing it to relatives. I'm asking the official record to be accurate," Sabrina muttered. "So you can pull it out later." I looked at her. "Only if someone later says something that isn't true." Caroline's face on the screen stayed perfectly neutral, but I remembered the November walkthrough when Sabrina had mocked my timestamps and I had told her I only documented the things people later swore they never said. The final report was corrected. It described the sequence without blame language. Floral installation approved by bride. East service corridor obstructed. Plated service temporarily paused under venue protocol. Installation modified. Service resumed. My name appeared only where it needed to. Sabrina's appeared where hers needed to. I did not circulate it beyond the people who normally received incident documentation, and when Marcus asked me later whether I had finally buried Sabrina in her own spreadsheet, I told him no. Facts were not supposed to be weapons every time you were angry enough to use them. By then, however, rumors about the succession fight had started moving through the office. Nobody knew the whole story, which meant everybody knew a different version. I heard that I had demanded the president job. I heard that Sabrina had already been appointed. I heard that I was threatening to leave because Dad had chosen his favorite daughter. One particularly creative version claimed I had intentionally stopped my sister's wedding dinner to demonstrate that the company could not function without me. I almost admired how efficiently several separate events had been compressed into one ridiculous story. Marcus did not find it funny. He came into my office 2 days before Christmas, closed the door, and said, "Tell me who I'm allowed to correct." I looked up from a vendor renewal. Nobody. He frowned. That's not a serious answer. I told him it was. He had already heard someone in sales say I was refusing to support Sabrina because I was jealous. Marcus wanted to tell them he had been in the kitchen, that he knew exactly what happened, and that anyone who thought I had sabotaged the wedding could ask the banquet director. I shook my head. Don't fight family gossip at work. Do your job. He looked genuinely offended. This isn't just family gossip. They're talking about you professionally. I said, then the professional record can answer professional questions. I am not turning my team into my character witnesses. He was quiet for a moment, then asked, Are you leaving? That question landed differently. I put down my pen. I don't know yet. Marcus looked at me for a long time. You always know. I almost smiled. Apparently not. He glanced toward the operations floor through the glass wall. People are nervous. I asked whether they were nervous because of me or because they thought their jobs were in danger. He said, Both. I told him there were no layoffs planned, no venue closures, and nothing operational they needed to panic about. Then I added, and if my situation changes, you'll hear what affects this team from me, not from the hallway. Elena appeared later with 2 coffees, one of which she set in front of me without asking. Marcus thinks he's your personal defense attorney now. I said, he'd be terrible at billing. She sat down. What are you going to do? I gave her the same answer. I don't know. Elena nodded as if that answer did not disappoint her. Good. I looked at her. Why does everyone around me react to uncertainty like I finally learned a new skill? She smiled. Because you usually solve questions before the rest of us have finished asking them. I told her I was reviewing my options. She said, That sounds more like you. Then, after a pause, she asked, Are you okay? Not whether I plan to stay. Not whether operations would be covered. Just whether I was okay. I had spent so much time wondering what the company needed from me that the simplicity of the question almost embarrassed me. I'm angry, I said. And I'm trying not to make permanent decisions just because I'm angry. Elena nodded. That seems wise, I added, which is incredibly inconvenient. She laughed and lifted her coffee. There she is. After Christmas, I changed how I worked. Not dramatically enough that anyone outside the company would have noticed. I did not stop answering emails, disappear from meetings, or announce that every problem now belonged to someone else. I started doing something much less dramatic, and, to my family, much more irritating. I made ownership visible. If Sabrina wanted to approve a client-driven staffing change that affected labor cost, the approval field showed Sabrina Caldwell. I still attached the operating analysis. I still explained the cost, staffing ratio, and service risk. What I stopped doing was turning her preference into my decision before sending it downstream. When Victor wanted an exception to the first quarter capital budget so one venue could accelerate a renovation package, I gave him the cash flow impact and asked his office to document that the exception was founder-directed. His assistant called and asked whether I could simply put it through under operations because that was how we had handled similar things before. I said, That's exactly what I'm changing. She sounded worried that I was making a political statement. I told her, I'm making an accounting statement. Whoever decides owns the assumption. Victor noticed within a week. He called me and said, Why is my name suddenly appearing on every exception? I answered, Because they're your exceptions. He said, You know perfectly well I expect you to use judgment. I told him, I am. My judgment is that decision authority and decision ownership should match. There was a pause. This is childish. I asked, Which part? He said, You know what part? I told him, No. I know you're accustomed to giving direction informally and having operations convert it into an executable decision. I'm still happy to execute approved decisions. I'm just not going to make your decision look like mine. He ended the call without saying goodbye. The first week of January showed me the danger in taking that principle too far. One of our downtown properties had a large corporate event scheduled just after New Year's. Sabrina's team had sold the client an expanded hospitality format after the original contract was signed. Additional chef, attended stations, more guest interaction, and a premium service presentation. The client loved it. The problem was labor. The revised format needed 8 additional event staff if we wanted to deliver it at the standard Sabrina had promised. Our young general manager at the property, Maya Chen, submitted the staffing request through the normal system. Sabrina, concerned about margin after several holiday events had run over labor budget, responded that the client enhancement needed to stay within the existing labor allocation. Maya called me the next morning. "I need a decision," she said. I had the request open in front of me. Sabrina owns the client enhancement. I know. She also owns the instruction to keep labor flat. I know. Then send the conflict back to her. I did. What did she say? That brand believes operations should be able to redesign the service pattern. I felt an old reflex rise immediately. I could see the solution in less than a minute. Reduce 1 station. Change 2 positions from static service to rotating coverage. Move a captain. Add 4 agency staff instead of 8. And absorb the difference inside venue labor contingency. It was not perfect, but it would work. I did not say any of that. This is Sabrina's decision, I told Maya. She needs to choose whether the service promise or the labor cap moves. Maya hesitated. The agency hold expires at noon. Then tell her that. I did. I looked at the clock. It was 10:45. Give her time to answer. I hung up and went into another meeting. At 11:30, Maya sent me a message. No response yet. Agency needs confirmation by noon. I read it. Then I put my phone face down. I told myself I was setting a boundary. Sabrina had asked for authority. Victor wanted her treated like the future president. If I jumped in again, I would prove Sabrina's accusation about me all over. She needed the chance to finish the decision herself. At 11:52, Elena stepped into my office. Why is Maya trying to find backup servers directly? I looked up. She shouldn't be. That is what I thought. I checked my phone. Sabrina still had not answered. Elena watched my face. What are you doing? Not rescuing. Who? Sabrina. Elena's expression changed. Maya looks pretty rescued to me. I opened my mouth, then stopped. Elena came farther into the room. Sabrina can survive losing an agency hold. Maya is the one standing there with a client promise she didn't make, a labor cap she didn't set, and no authority to move either one. That was the moment I understood I had confused 2 completely different things. A boundary was refusing to carry Sabrina's consequence for her. What I was doing was letting the consequence slide downhill until it landed on someone who had never made the decision. I stood up and called Maya immediately. Book the 4 agency staff still available. Use venue contingency. I'm approving it under operations because we are inside the service recovery threshold. She exhaled hard enough that I could hear it through the phone. Thank you, I told her. And send me the entire approval chain. You did nothing wrong. We adjusted the service format, brought in 4 additional people, and the event went well. No client ever knew there had been an internal argument. Nobody worked a double shift to prove a point. No manager had to explain why executives above her could not decide who owned 8 temporary staff. After the event, I asked Maya to meet with me. She arrived looking nervous, probably assuming I wanted to discuss why she had tried to find backup labor outside the normal process. Instead, I said, I owe you an apology. Her eyebrows went up. For what? I knew the decision path above you was unclear, and I waited too long because I was trying not to interfere. You were trying to make Sabrina answer. Yes. Maya looked uncertain whether she was allowed to agree. I said, You don't have to protect my feelings. I made you stand under an argument that belonged above your pay grade. She gave a small smile. It wasn't my favorite morning. I imagine not. I told her that going forward, if 2 executives gave incompatible constraints and her deadline would hit before either resolved them, she was authorized to escalate directly to me for a temporary operational decision. That would protect the event without transferring permanent ownership of the original business decision. Then we documented the policy so it applied to every general manager, not just Maya. Elena was waiting when I came back to my office. How painful was that? She asked. Apologizing? Learning. Extremely. She sat on the edge of my desk. Boundary isn't the same as leaving someone under a falling ceiling. I know that now. You knew it before. I knew it conceptually. Elena smiled. Ah, executive disease. I looked at the handwritten note I had made during my conversation with Maya. Protect clients and staff. Let executives own executive consequences. It was not elegant. It was not a corporate policy statement. It was a rule for me. I will do my job, I said. Elena nodded. I will not do yours. That one's going on a mug, I added. And I'm not letting an innocent person get crushed just because I'm trying to prove somebody else should have moved. Her expression softened. That sounds better. The correction mattered almost immediately because Sabrina noticed the new approval structure and hated it. A week later, she came into my office holding a printed staffing summary with her own name highlighted beside 3 decisions. What is this? She asked. I said, a decision owner report. She dropped it on my desk. Why does it look like you're building a case against me? I told her every executive's decisions appeared in the same report, including mine and Victor's. It's not a case, it's ownership. She said, nobody needed this level of documentation before. I answered, apparently we did. We just didn't know it yet. She sat down without being invited. Dad says you're doing this because you're angry about the promotion. I looked at her. And what do you think? Sabrina shrugged. I think you're angry about the promotion. I said, I'm angry about being treated like I agreed to something I never agreed to. She rolled her eyes. Same difference. I told her it was not even close to the same difference. Then she said, Dad told me you preferred operations. I know. He said you didn't want to spend your life doing board politics and investor dinners. I don't particularly enjoy either one. So, maybe he believed you. Believed what? A sentence I never said? Sabrina looked away. I continued. He told me there would be a succession process after your wedding. He told you I wanted to stay exactly where I was. He told the board I was committed. Those are 3 different stories. He was trying to keep everyone calm. That is what people say when the truth is inconvenient. She looked back at me, annoyed. You always make everything sound sinister. No, I'm making it sound documented. For a moment, she almost smiled. Then the defensiveness returned. Maybe I deserve one chance without you standing behind me. The sentence was more honest than most of what we had said to each other in weeks. I leaned back. Maybe you do. She blinked. I mean it. Maybe you deserve to lead without everyone assuming I'm the real decision-maker behind you. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Then I said, so take it. She waited. Without me standing behind you. The relaxation disappeared. That's not what I meant. I know. You're making my point for me. No, Sabrina. You want the chance to prove you can lead, but you also want certainty that if something goes wrong, I'll still be underneath the structure, making sure it never gets bad enough to count against you. That's what an operations executive does. An operations executive runs operations. She does not guarantee a president never experiences the cost of her own decisions. You haven't even decided whether you're leaving. That's true. Then why are you acting like you already have 1 foot out the door? Because for the first time, I'm treating staying as a choice instead of the default. She looked at me for several seconds. I could tell she wanted to argue, but there was nowhere easy to take the conversation. If she said she needed me, she weakened her own argument. If she said she did not, then my refusal to guarantee 3 years should not matter. Finally, she stood. I still want the job. I know. And I'm not apologizing for that. I'm not asking you to. She picked up the staffing report. You really think Dad planned all of this? I think Dad told each of us the version most likely to keep us where he wanted us. That sounds like something you decided. It is. That distinction mattered. At that point, I did not have an email where Victor admitted manipulating either of us. I had his words to me, his words as Sabrina repeated them, the succession chart, and the internal expectations beginning to form around my staying. I could infer a pattern. I could not yet prove intention. Sabrina paused at my door. For what it's worth, I really did think you wanted operations. I looked at her. Because Dad said so? Partly. And the other part? She gave me a tired half smile. Because whenever anyone offers you the room, you walk straight toward the machine behind the wall. That was unfair. It was also not entirely wrong. After she left, I sat for a while thinking about how many times I had confused being most comfortable with a responsibility and being obligated to keep it forever. Operations had been my world for most of my adult life. I was good at it. I liked it. None of those facts meant someone else could use them to decide the limit of my career. The next morning, General Counsel forwarded a formal request from the board's finance committee. The two proposed acquisitions had moved into lender underwriting, and the board wanted senior management certifications attached to the operating model before the next review. Finance would handle the financial schedules. Legal would handle representations within its scope. Brand would confirm revenue assumptions tied to pipeline and booked business. Operations belonged to me. I opened the attachment. At the top of the first page was a line I had seen hundreds of times in one form or another. Management certifies that the operating assumptions contained herein are reasonable and supportable based on currently available information. Below it was my name. The deadline was the following week. For the first time since Sabrina's wedding, the question in front of me had nothing to do with hurt feelings, family roles, or who deserved which title. They wanted my signature on the numbers. And unlike a wedding dinner, I could not simply give someone else control and walk toward the kitchen. The certification request landed on my desk on January 6th, the first Tuesday after the holiday slowdown ended, and by 10 that morning I understood why everybody suddenly cared whether my name appeared at the bottom of a forecast. Caldwell Event Group had signed letters of intent to acquire 2 additional venues, one outside Murfreesboro and another west of Nashville. Together, the properties would cost a little under $18 million before renovations and integration expenses. Neither deal was final. Both sellers had given us roughly 45 days of exclusivity to finish due diligence and financing, which meant the clock had started running before most of the company knew there was a clock. Claire Donnelly, our CFO, walked me through the timeline with Hannah sitting beside me. The original target is early March, she said. We need lender approval, final property diligence, insurance work, and purchase agreements negotiated before then. I asked what happened if financing took longer. Claire tapped the Murfreesboro file. This seller will probably give us a little room if we're close. Then she touched the other file. This one won't. They already have a backup bidder who wanted exclusivity and didn't get it. If we miss our window, they're free to go back to them. How serious is the backup bidder? Serious enough that their attorney calls every week asking whether our deal is still alive. That was useful information. It meant every day mattered, but it also meant panic would not create more days. I asked whether the lender knew my retention agreement was unsigned. Claire looked mildly surprised that I needed to ask. Of course. Legal sent the current status with the package. They know it's pending. I nodded. That was exactly how it should have been. Whatever my family was doing internally, I had no interest in creating a fictional banking scandal to make them look worse than they were. Claire slid the operating forecast toward me. What they need from you is the capacity certification. I know. Victor wants this through credit committee as soon as possible. I'm sure he does. Claire gave me a look. She knew enough about the family conflict to hear what I had not said, but she stayed on the numbers. They're modeling both venues opening within 7 months of closing. I looked down at the schedule. That's aggressive. It's what the acquisition team presented. Acquisition teams enjoy calendars more when they don't have to staff them. Hannah coughed into her hand to hide a laugh. Claire did not. She had been CFO too long to find executive sarcasm particularly entertaining. That's why your name is on the certification. For the next 2 days, Hannah and I dismantled the operating model one assumption at a time. Most of it was defensible. The venues themselves were established businesses, not empty buildings we planned to bring online from scratch. We would inherit local teams. We already had centralized procurement, finance, marketing, and technology infrastructure that could absorb part of the growth. The revenue assumptions were ambitious but not absurd. Sabrina's commercial team had identified real demand, and several existing clients had already asked whether we planned to expand farther outside central Nashville. The problem appeared when we reached management capacity. Hannah had built a staffing bridge comparing current operating leadership with what the 7-venue structure would require. She turned her monitor toward me. This is the version finance sent yesterday. I studied the rows. Where are the 2 GM promotions? Moved to Q4. Why? No explanation in the file. And the additional regional operations director? Gone. I scrolled farther. Training support? Reduced. Integration manager? Temporary consultant for 12 weeks. I looked at her. Who runs the 2 openings after week 12? Hannah gave me the expression analysts use when the spreadsheet has already answered a question people would prefer not to ask. I opened the Assumptions tab. The forecast stated that current senior operating leadership had sufficient capacity to integrate both acquisitions with limited incremental overhead. Hannah: yes? What does current senior operating leadership mean? I was afraid of that. She pointed to the staffing model. Technically. Elena too. Elena already covers 5 venues. I know. And we're adding 2 properties, promoting no one until 4th quarter, removing the director role, cutting training support, and assuming existing leadership absorbs integration. That is what this version says. I leaned back. Who changed it? She opened the file history. Finance had updated the model after an executive review. I could see edits from several people, but the final staffing assumptions had been entered after a meeting involving Victor and the acquisition team. That alone did not make the numbers dishonest. Executives changed forecasts constantly. A plan could become leaner after review. The question was whether the revised plan was still operationally supportable. I asked Hannah to run 3 versions. The first used the forecast exactly as written. The second added the 2 GM promotions and 1 operations director 6 months earlier. The third assumed only 1 acquisition closed. By the following afternoon, the difference was obvious. The version Victor preferred had the best short-term margins because it delayed roughly $1 million in combined management, training, recruitment, and transition expense over the integration period. It also required existing leadership to absorb a workload I would not have approved even if I had already committed to stay. That distinction mattered. My problem was not simply that the model assumed I would remain. Even if I had signed the retention agreement that morning, I still would not have certified the staffing plan as written. I went to Victor's office with 3 printed versions. He barely looked at the alternatives before saying, "Claire told me you're holding the operating certification. I'm reviewing it. We don't have weeks. I've had it 2 days. You know what I mean." I placed the versions on his desk. This is the model finance sent me. This is the version with the management resources operations originally requested. This is a 1 acquisition case. He glanced at the pages. The lender doesn't need every internal staffing decision finalized today. They need me to certify the assumptions are reasonable. They are reasonable. Then why is my signature necessary? Victor's mouth tightened. Don't do that. Do what? Turn every sentence into a fight about authority. This one literally is about authority. My name is on the certification. He picked up the lean version. Projections change. We can adjust hiring after credit committee. Then the forecast isn't describing the company we're financing. It describes the current plan. No, it describes the cheapest version of the plan. It describes management discipline. I pointed to the staffing line. It describes Elena covering more venues, me running integration, 2 managers delaying promotions, and no permanent regional director until after both properties are supposed to be functioning inside our system. You're assuming every acquisition creates a crisis. I'm assuming 2 acquisitions create work. Victor pushed back from his desk. We can hire if we need to. Then budget it. We may not need to. Then show me who owns integration after the consultant leaves. He looked down at the forecast again. Just sign the version we already sent. If staffing changes, finance updates it later. I stared at him. The sentence was not illegal. It was not evidence of fraud. It was something executives probably said every day in companies where estimates changed faster than documents. But he was asking me to certify a version I did not believe represented the resources required to deliver the plan. I can't. His head came up. You can't, or you won't. Both. Renee, I will sign a version I can support. You're jeopardizing $18 million of acquisitions over an org chart. No, I'm refusing to put my name under assumptions you can change by fixing the org chart. The seller has another bidder. I know. Then you understand the time pressure. I do. Time pressure doesn't make the numbers more true. He stood. You have become extraordinarily rigid since the wedding. I collected the 2 alternate models and left the original on his desk. No, I've become more careful about signing my name to decisions somebody else wants to own later. He did not answer before I walked out. That afternoon, Sabrina surprised me by being excellent in an expansion presentation. The board's working group had asked brand and partnerships to explain where the additional revenue would come from if we added 2 properties so quickly. Sabrina walked them through our existing pipeline without inflating it. She separated contracted events from leads, identified which national clients had requested additional geographic coverage, and openly admitted that one revenue assumption in the first-year model was too optimistic. When Martin challenged her on whether clients would actually move events outside Nashville, she did not become defensive. She showed 3 accounts that had already asked us to do exactly that. I watched her from the other side of the table and thought, not for the first time, that reducing Sabrina to a spoiled little sister would have made my life easier and the truth less accurate. She belonged in that room. The problem was not that she belonged there. The problem was what happened when the conversation moved from selling the future to operating it. Claire brought up the 7-month integration schedule. Assuming both deals close on the current timetable, do you see them opening under the Caldwell operating model simultaneously? Sabrina paused. As close together as possible, she said. Martin asked, why? Commercial momentum. We would be marketing both properties during the same cycle. That's the sales answer. I'm asking about execution. Sabrina looked toward the screen. Operations has already built integration playbooks. Martin said, I'm aware. I'm asking whether you, as the proposed president, would open both on the same timeline. For a fraction of a second, her eyes moved toward me. The room noticed. I could have rescued her without anyone realizing it. I knew the answer I would give. Stagger the systems conversion, separate the major staff training windows, and do not force 2 inherited management teams through procurement, payroll, event standards, and technology migration simultaneously unless we funded more integration support. But Martin had asked Sabrina. She looked back at him. I'd want to understand the operational constraints before committing to simultaneous conversion. That's fair. What constraints? Again, she looked toward me. This time I answered only what belonged to my current role. The primary constraints are management bandwidth, training windows, technology migration, and maintaining service at the 5 existing properties during integration. Sabrina nodded. Then I would want those quantified before setting the final sequence. Martin asked. And if quantifying them shows simultaneous integration is cheaper on paper but significantly riskier operationally? Sabrina hesitated, then said, then we stagger. It was the right answer. Not elegant. Not visionary. Right. After the meeting, she caught up with me near the elevators. You could have answered faster. He asked you. You knew what he wanted. So did you eventually. She pressed the elevator button harder than necessary. You enjoyed that. No. She looked at me. I reconsidered. Maybe 5%. That's generous. You answered correctly. After looking at you twice. That happens when you're learning a part of the business you haven't run. She crossed her arms. You say that like it doesn't prove your point. It proves you need experience. So did I. The elevator arrived. She stepped inside, then held the door. You really think I can learn it? I looked at her. Yes. Her face softened for half a second. Then I added, I just don't think learning it should require me promising 3 years of invisible insurance. The doors closed between us. Later that week, I was asked to fact-check a leadership deck being prepared for the next board review. That request was normal. If a slide mentioned operating improvements, my team verified the numbers. I expected to correct a few margins, update a venue count, and send it back. Instead, I found a slide titled Sabrina Caldwell Leadership Initiatives. The first bullet described a labor model redesign that had reduced agency staffing across multiple properties. Marcus and I had built that system with Elena over 18 months. The second described vendor consolidation that had improved purchasing leverage. My operations team had led the project with finance. The third described margin improvement at Hawthorne Hall. Sabrina's client mix had contributed to revenue growth, but the margin work itself came from staffing changes, procurement, and service redesign. I read the slide twice. Then I called Hannah into my office. Tell me I'm reading this wrong. She stood beside my desk and scanned the bullets. Which part? The owner. Hannah opened the deck metadata. Earlier versions had separate sections labeled Commercial Growth Initiatives and Operations Transformation. At some point, the sections had been combined into a broader leadership narrative under Sabrina's name. Who made the merge? I asked. She clicked through the revision history. Strategy team drafted it. Approved by? She scrolled. Victor. I kept reading. Did Sabrina see this version? Hannah checked the review chain. She commented on slide 12 yesterday. This is slide 11. She had access. That was not proof she had written the language. It did mean she had reviewed a deck where achievements created by several teams appeared under her name and had not corrected them. Marcus reacted exactly as I expected when I showed him. Oh, absolutely not. Marcus. No. Send the whole revision history to Martin. I'm not doing that. Why? Because half this slide isn't false. He stared at me. My labor model is under her name. Our labor model. That is not helping. I pointed to the first bullet. The initiative also supported client promises her team sold. The problem isn't that Sabrina had zero involvement. The problem is that the slide collapses ownership until it looks like she originated everything, which is called taking credit. Yes, so show them. I will correct the slide. He looked disappointed. That's it? That's the job. I opened the deck and changed the heading from Sabrina Caldwell Leadership Initiatives to Cross-Functional Performance Initiatives. Then I broke each bullet into sponsor, operating owner, contributors, implementation dates, and measurable result. Sabrina remained attached to the items she had actually influenced. My name appeared where I had actually led. Elena's did too. Marcus's did too. Marcus watched over my shoulder. You're leaving her on 3 of them. She belongs on 3 of them. She let the original version sit there. That doesn't mean I get to replace one misleading story with another. He sighed. You're no fun when you're principled. I've heard. He started toward the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, I don't need them to know my name. I looked at him. I just hate watching them erase yours. That hit harder than his anger had. I know. He nodded once and left. I sent the corrected deck back with a neutral note explaining that leadership attribution had been revised to reflect project ownership and contribution. No accusation. No emotional commentary. No attachment labeled, "Proof my sister is a fraud." Victor called 20 minutes later. You changed the narrative structure. I corrected attribution. It's a leadership deck, not an employee recognition program. Then leadership should survive accurate attribution. He exhaled. Sabrina's section was meant to show executive-level impact. Then use her executive-level impact. Client acquisition. Brand repositioning. National account growth. Those are real. You're splitting hairs. No, I'm splitting work. He ended the call. The seller deadline came up again the following Monday. Claire reminded us that the Western Properties backup bidder remained active and that our exclusivity would not be automatically extended if financing slipped. Nobody dramatized it. There was simply a date on the calendar after which the seller regained options. The Murfreesboro property appeared more flexible. But even that owner would not wait indefinitely while Caldwell Event Group debated its management structure. For the first time, I understood how Victor planned to use the deadline without ever making an explicit threat. He did not need to say, "Sign or we lose the deals." He only needed everyone to know that the deals might be lost if I did not sign. Guilt would do the rest if I let it. That Friday afternoon, Allison Grant emailed me again. Her message was short. She had heard through industry contacts that Caldwell Event Group was expanding and wondered whether my situation had changed. 3 months earlier, I would have asked about salary before almost anything else. Instead, when we spoke, I asked her who the regional role reported to, what decisions required corporate approval, how property leaders were evaluated, whether operations owned its staffing models, and what happened when commercial commitments exceeded delivery capacity. Allison laughed once. "You've become more specific. I've had an educational quarter." She told me the role under discussion would report to the company's chief operating officer, not the founding family behind any particular property. Regional leadership had authority over staffing architecture, vendor standards, integration sequencing, and operating budgets within defined thresholds. Major acquisitions still went through Corporate Investment Committee, but once a deal was approved, operations was not expected to pretend resources were free. "Compensation matters," she said. "But I'm guessing that's not your first question anymore." "It's still on the list." "Good. I'm not taking a vow of poverty to prove I have principles." That made her laugh again. I did not accept anything. There was still no formal offer. I simply agreed to continue the conversation. When I hung up, Hannah was standing at my office door holding the latest staffing model. "Do you have a minute?" "Come in." She put the file on my desk. Finance updated the integration assumptions. I scanned the page. Better? Somewhat. 1 GM promotion moved earlier. Still no permanent operations director. I nodded. "I'll review it." Hannah did not leave. "What?" She hesitated. "Can I ask you something, not analyst?" "To VP? That depends entirely on how dangerous it is." "Why is everyone planning next year like you already signed?" I looked at her. "What do you mean?" Elena asked whether I wanted to help build the 7-venue reporting model. Marcus is being asked for staffing forecasts through next fall. The acquisition team listed you as executive integration lead on the transition calendar. I'm currently VP of operations. Some of that is normal. I know. But people keep saying you'll be here through expansion. Who keeps saying that? Hannah shifted her weight. Pretty much everybody. I closed the model. Where did they hear it? I thought from you. They didn't. Her expression changed. The next hour was uncomfortable because I had to ask questions without creating a rumor bigger than the one I was investigating. Elena had heard from one of the general managers that senior leadership had been told continuity was settled. Marcus had heard the same thing from workforce planning. Neither believed I had signed because I had already told them I had not made a decision. But other managers had no reason to doubt what they were hearing. Eventually, I called one of our longest-serving property managers, a man who had no interest in family politics and even less talent for inventing them. "Who told you I was committed through expansion?" There was a pause. "Victor." "When?" "Leadership call last week." "What exactly did he say?" Another pause, longer this time. "He said you'd committed in principle to remain through the expansion, and that legal was working through the documentation." I felt my hand tighten around the phone. Did he use those words? Pretty close. "Renee, I assumed you knew. I do now." I told him he had done nothing wrong and ended the call. For several seconds, I sat without moving. I had not signed. I had not committed in principle. I had not told Victor I intended to remain through the expansion. In fact, I had formally instructed General Counsel that nobody was authorized to describe me as committed. The lender still knew the agreement was pending. That part remained clean. Inside the company, apparently, my future had already been announced. Again, only this time, Victor had not merely assumed where I would stand. He had started telling other people I was already standing there. The phrase "committed in principle" bothered me more than the unsigned retention agreement ever had. An agreement at least admitted it needed my consent. Committed in principle did something quieter. It took the decision out of my hands. announced the result to everyone else, and left me with the uncomfortable job of either making the announcement true or becoming the person who disrupted everybody's plans. I went to General Counsel the next morning with the names of 3 managers who had heard some version of the same message. I did not accuse Victor of fraud, and I did not ask her to build a case against my father. I asked a much narrower question. Has anyone been told in writing that I agreed to stay through expansion? She did not answer immediately. I need to check. Please do. And Renee? Yes? If I find something, I'm going to treat it as a governance issue, not a family dispute. That's exactly what I want. An hour later, she asked me to come back. There were 2 emails on the conference room screen. The first was from her to Victor in late December, after I had formally said I would not execute the retention agreement under the existing terms. Her wording was careful. Renee Caldwell has not committed to remain through the expansion period. Until the retention agreement is executed or separate written consent is obtained, internal and external materials should describe her status as pending. The second email had gone from Victor to an internal board distribution list less than 2 weeks later. Management continuity remains secure. Renee has committed in principle to remain through the expansion, and legal is finalizing documentation. I read it twice. Then I asked, did I miss the conversation where I committed in principle? Counsel looked tired. Not that I'm aware of. Did you correct this? I spoke to Victor after I saw it. What did he say? That he believed your continued involvement was understood. I laughed once, but there was nothing funny about it. Understood by whom? She did not answer because she did not need to. I pointed at the earlier email. You told him not to say this. Yes, and he said it anyway. Yes. Is that illegal? No. Her answer came quickly, which I appreciated. She continued. But it creates a credibility problem, especially because the board is relying on management representations while reviewing a major transaction. What about the lender? The lender has never been told you signed. I nodded. Their file still shows retention pending execution, she said. They have the draft agreement. They know they're waiting for it, so they weren't misled. Not about the document. That distinction mattered to me. I was angry enough without enlarging the facts. Victor had not forged my name. He had not sent a fake agreement to a bank. He had done something more characteristic of him. He had treated his expectation as if it were already a decision. Counsel leaned back. I need clarity from you now. Are you still considering the retention agreement? I looked down at the 2 emails. No. She studied me. You're declining it? Yes. Permanently? Yes. The word felt smaller than the decision. She nodded slowly. Then I'll notify the appropriate parties that retention will not be executed. What happens with the facility? The lender will review the management risk. They may ask for a revised integration plan, different staffing assumptions, additional executive hires, changes to the timing, or other protections. They don't cancel everything today. No. Good. She gave me a faint smile. You keep expecting drama. I grew up with Victor. That afternoon, Claire confirmed the financing facility would go back into management risk review. Credit had not been denied. Nobody closed a vault, tore up a check, or sent our 2 acquisitions into the ocean. The lender wanted to understand what the operating structure looked like if the person identified as central to integration had declined a 3-year retention commitment and was simultaneously refusing to certify the current staffing model. Claire put it simply. They financed one management picture. Now the picture is changing. That seems fair. It is. It's also inconvenient. I know. The exclusivity dates don't stop while we figure it out. I know that too. She gave me the calendar. The Western venue seller had already reminded our acquisition team that another bidder remained interested. The Murfreesboro seller was still cooperative, but both agreements had limits. If Caldwell could provide a credible revised operating structure quickly, we might still close one or both deals. If we could not, the sellers were free to move on. For the rest of the day, I tried to work as if I had not just changed the risk profile of the biggest expansion Caldwell Event Group had attempted in years. I reviewed a venue budget. I answered a property manager's question about a vendor renewal. I sat through a staffing call. Every ordinary task felt strange because somewhere else in the company, people were recalculating a future they had been told already included me. Victor called at 5:40. Come upstairs. I have a call in 20 minutes. This won't take 20. It took 45. He was standing behind his desk when I entered. The retention agreement was in front of him, along with the revised forecast I had refused to certify. He did not invite me to sit. Legal says you declined the agreement. I did, after everything we discussed. Yes. He stared at me. Do you understand what you're doing? I understand exactly what I'm doing. The lender is reviewing the facility. Because the management assumptions changed. Because you changed them. No. Because they were built around a commitment I never made. Victor came around the desk. Everyone is counting on you. Because you told them to. His face hardened. That's not fair. It's extremely fair. We have 500 people whose jobs are affected by what this company does next. And none of their current jobs disappear because we don't buy 2 more venues. You know how growth works. I do. Then stop pretending this is theoretical. I'm not. I'm saying you do not get to use employees as leverage after promising them my future without asking me. Victor paced once toward the window and back. What do you want? It was the first time he had asked that question directly. I almost answered too quickly. I want you to stop building plans that require my consent before you have it. That's procedural. What do you want? I don't know yet. He looked almost offended. You're willing to jeopardize acquisitions and you don't know what you want? I know what I don't want. This is ridiculous. No, what was ridiculous was telling the board I had committed in principle after council told you I hadn't. His expression shifted. That was an internal update. It was still false. It reflected where I believed this would land. That is the entire problem. He lowered his voice. Fine. More money. I stared at him. We can improve the retention package. Increase the first-year payment. Add an equity grant. I'm not negotiating the price of consent you assumed you already had. Everybody has a number. I'm sure they do. Then tell me yours. My problem isn't the number. Victor laughed without humor. You have spent your entire career telling me incentives matter. They do. So, an incentive is not a substitute for a decision. He walked back behind his desk and opened a folder. Future equity. A larger participation pool. You want more authority? We can revise your approval thresholds. You want a stronger title? Fine. Executive Vice President. Chief Operating Officer eventually. We can structure it. Eventually. The word told me everything. You still want Sabrina as president. Yes. And you still want me to make that safe. I want both my daughters in leadership. On terms you chose. Somebody has to choose. The board has 7 seats for a reason. He slammed the folder closed. You're enjoying this. I went still. Enjoying what? Making me ask. There it was again. The assumption that my boundary must secretly be revenge because he could not imagine why else I would refuse something profitable. I'm not enjoying any of this. You have all the leverage, and you know it. That doesn't mean I created the leverage. You could fix this. I looked at him for a long moment. That sentence used to work on me every time. His face changed. I continued. Something goes wrong. Somebody needs help. A deal gets difficult. Sabrina promises too much. A venue is understaffed. You say I can fix it, and I do. Then everyone learns that if they build the problem close enough to me, eventually I'll pick it up. This is not a therapy session. No, it's an explanation. I don't need one. I think you do. He looked away. I thought about the managers who believed I had already promised to stay. I thought about Maya standing under 2 incompatible executive instructions because I had briefly confused boundaries with abandonment. I thought about Marcus asking whether I was leaving, and Hannah asking why everybody was planning next year as if I had signed. My team was the reason Victor's arguments still hurt. He knew it. If you walk now, he said more quietly, they're the ones who carry the weight. I felt that one. He saw it. Elena will take more. Marcus will take more. Hannah will take more. Every GM who calls you now will call someone less experienced. I hated him for being partly right. They trust you, he said. I know. You built that team. I know. Then don't abandon them because you're angry with me. For several seconds, I had no answer. That was the darkest part of the whole thing. Not the wedding, not Sabrina's title, not even the email. It was the possibility that the only way to stop being used was to hurt people who had never used me. I left Victor's office without agreeing to anything. That night, I barely slept. At 2 a.m, I opened my laptop and looked at the operating structure I had spent years building. Elena's responsibilities, Marcus's workforce systems, Hannah's reporting architecture, the general managers I had trained, delegation matrices, vendor owners, crisis protocols, cross-property coverage. For years, I had told myself my job was to build systems strong enough that no single person could become a point of failure. Then I had quietly made myself the exception. If the company truly could not function without me, that was not proof of my value. It was proof I had failed at part of my job. The next morning, I called Allison Grant. I'm ready to talk seriously. She did not sound surprised. The position had become formal since our last conversation. Regional Vice President of Operations for a national venue management group, overseeing a multi-state portfolio. The compensation was better than my current package, but not dramatically enough to make the decision about money. What mattered was the reporting structure, defined authority, and the fact that nobody on the org chart shared my last name. Allison said, "If we move forward, how much notice would you need?" 90 days. That's longer than we usually see. I have responsibilities I'm not walking away from overnight. We can work with that. The offer came several days later, conditional on normal background checks and final executive approval. I did not sign immediately. I read everything. I asked questions about travel, staffing authority, bonus metrics, termination terms, and restrictions on recruiting employees from my current company. Then I signed. Before I submitted my resignation, I called Elena, Marcus, and Hannah into the small. Marcus walked in carrying a notebook. "Why does this feel like an ambush?" "Because you're dramatic. That is hurtful." Elena sat across from me and looked at my face. Her expression changed immediately. Hannah noticed Elena noticing me. I closed the door. "I wanted you to hear this from me." Marcus stopped joking. "You're leaving," he said. "Yes." Hannah looked down at the table. Elena asked, "When?" 90 days after I submit notice." Marcus leaned back. "That's it?" I waited. He shook his head. "I don't mean 90 days. I mean after everything you built here, you're just leaving?" "I'm not just leaving. It feels pretty much like leaving." "Marcus." He looked away. I could have reassured them immediately. That was my instinct. Tell them everything would be fine. Promise I would make sure nobody struggled. Promise I would answer calls forever. Promise that even after leaving, I would somehow remain the person who fixed everything. I stopped myself. "Tell me what you're scared of." Marcus looked back at me. "What?" "Not what you're angry about. What are you scared of?" He hesitated. "They replace you with somebody who thinks operations means walking through a ballroom with a clipboard." Hannah laughed despite herself. Marcus continued. "Somebody who doesn't know why the managers trust you. Somebody who cuts staffing because a spreadsheet says labor is too high and then blames the venue when service falls apart." "That's fair. It's more than fair." "I know." Elena asked, "Who have you recommended?" I looked at her. She frowned. "Why are you looking at me like that?" "Because you're first on the succession recommendation." Elena blinked. "Excuse me? You heard me. For your job?" "Yes." Marcus pointed across the table. "Finally." Elena ignored him. "You already did that?" 3 weeks ago. Before you decided to leave?" "Before I admitted I had decided." Elena stared at me. "And the board?" "They'll review you like they should." "I'm recommending you. I'm not appointing you. That's a very Renee distinction." "It matters." Hannah had not said much. I turned toward her. "You okay?" "No." That was so honest I almost smiled. She rubbed one hand over her forehead. "I learned this job from you. Some of it. Most of it." "No." She looked at me. You learned how I do this job, I said. Now you have to figure out how you do it. What if I screw it up? You will. Marcus laughed. Hannah glared at him. I smiled. I did. I just got very good at fixing my mistakes before anyone noticed. You don't make mistakes. Elena and Marcus both made noises at the same time. I pointed at them. Thank you for the support, Elena said. We have files. I looked back at Hannah. Make mistakes. Fix them. Learn from them. Don't stay until midnight hiding them because you think being perfect is the admission price for being taken seriously. She looked down again. I knew I had probably given her the exact habit I was now warning her against. Marcus asked, Where are you going? I told them. He immediately said, Are they hiring? No. That sounded suspiciously fast. I am not recruiting any of you. Why? Because none of you owe me your career. The room went quiet. I continued. If you stay here, stay because this is still good for you. If you leave someday, leave because something else is better for you. Do not make either decision to prove you're loyal to me. Marcus said, What if I'm loyal to you? Then buy me lunch after I leave. That's cold. You can buy dinner. Elena smiled. I looked at all three of them. I mean it. Caldwell Event Group is not Victor. It's not Sabrina. It's not me either. You have careers here that belong to you. Marcus sighed. I still hate this. You're allowed. Good. Just don't make me responsible for your feelings too. That was almost warm. It's the best you're getting. The truth was, I loved those people enough that leaving them hurt more than leaving the company name did. On February 20th, I submitted my resignation. My notice stated that my final day would be May 20th. I included a 90-day transition plan separating responsibilities across Elena, Marcus, Hannah, the property general managers, finance, and procurement. Vendor relationships had named owners. Current disputes had documentation. Pending approvals had status notes. I created no mysterious password problem, took no company files, deleted nothing, and contacted no employee about joining me elsewhere. I also included a recommendation that Elena be considered for the permanent operations role through a formal review process. Victor read the letter in silence. When he finished, he looked at me. You actually did it. Yes. You signed with another company. Yes. Before the board meeting. I made my employment decision before the board made a succession decision. He placed the letter on his desk. You realize how this looks. I've stopped managing how my decisions look to people who already decided what they mean. His face hardened. You're going to regret this. Maybe. That answer surprised him. I picked up my copy of the resignation letter. But if I do, at least it will be my mistake. Less than an hour later, Martin called me. He did not congratulate me. He did not ask whether I was trying to force the board's hand. His tone was more serious than I had ever heard it. We're calling a special meeting tomorrow morning. I assumed you might. Succession, lender review, management continuity, and the acquisition timetable are now one governance problem. I understand. Bring the retention agreement, your forecast comments, the corrected initiative ownership, and anything showing what was represented internally about your commitment. I have all of it. There was a pause. Then Martin said, Renee, listen to me carefully. Do not let Victor turn tomorrow into a family argument. I looked through my office glass at Elena explaining something to Hannah, while Marcus stood nearby pretending not to listen. What do you want me to do? Bring the documents, Martin said. And answer only what you can prove. For most of my life, when my family started arguing, I had been the person who stepped in and fixed the outcome. The next morning, for the first time, I planned to walk into the room with nothing but the record. The special board meeting started at 9 on Saturday morning, February 21st, less than 24 hours after I submitted my resignation. Caldwell Event Group had 7 board seats. Victor controlled 42% of the voting equity and had 3 directors who usually supported him. But our shareholder agreement required 5 of 7 votes to appoint or remove the CEO and to approve acquisitions of the size we were pursuing. My father was powerful. He was not legally capable of declaring a successor by himself and turning the rest of us into scenery. For years, That distinction had rarely mattered because Victor usually entered a meeting with enough support already lined up. That morning, for the first time I could remember, I did not think he knew where all 7 votes were going. I sat near General Counsel with a folder containing exactly what Martin had asked me to bring. The unsigned retention agreement, the succession chart, my forecast comments, the corrected leadership deck, its version history, the wedding change log, the banquet director's report, and the internal email describing me as committed in principle after counsel had specifically warned against that wording. I brought no private texts with Sabrina, no family messages from my mother, no notes about childhood. If the board wanted to discuss governance, I was going to give them governance. Sabrina sat across from me. She looked tired but composed. Victor sat at the head of the table and opened as though my resignation were an inconvenience that could still be incorporated into his existing plan. "We have a short-term management issue to resolve," he said. "My recommendation remains that Sabrina assume the president role as planned. Renee has chosen to pursue an outside opportunity, but I expect her to remain through an orderly transition while we adjust the operating structure." "I've given 90 days' notice," I said. "That is the transition I agreed to." Victor looked at me. "Which gives us time. Time to transition my current responsibilities. Not time to assume I'll extend beyond May 20th. One of the directors asked whether the 3-year retention agreement had ever been executed. General Counsel answered, "No." "Was there separate written consent?" "No." "Verbal?" Counsel looked at me before answering. "Not communicated to legal," I said. "There wasn't." Victor leaned back. "Nobody is disputing that the paperwork remained incomplete." Martin said, "Victor, the issue is not paperwork. Your January board update said Renee had committed in principle. That was my understanding." "Based on what?" "My conversations with her." I looked at him. "Which conversation?" Victor's jaw tightened. Martin turned toward me. "Did you ever tell Victor you were committed in principle to staying through expansion?" "No." "Did you tell him you intended to execute the retention agreement?" "No." "Did you authorize anyone to represent that you had?" "No. In fact, after I received the agreement, I specifically told counsel that nobody was authorized to describe me as committed." Counsel placed the December email on the screen. Her language was plain enough that the room did not need interpretation. My status was pending. No commitment should be represented as complete without an executed agreement or separate written consent. Then she placed Victor's January update beside it. "Management continuity remains secure. Renee has committed in principle to remain through the expansion, and legal is finalizing documentation." Nobody said anything for several seconds. Victor finally said, "I believed she would stay. She had spent almost her entire career here." "That is not the same as consent," Martin said. Victor looked at him sharply. "We all make management assumptions." "Yes," Martin replied. "And when legal tells you an assumption should not be represented as a commitment, you stop representing it as one." My father's face changed, in the way it always did when someone he considered an ally stopped helping him. He shifted the discussion to my wedding behavior before anyone could stay on the email too long. "We also need context for why this conflict accelerated. Renee has been increasingly adversarial since Sabrina's wedding. I almost admired the move. If he could make my resignation look like the emotional aftermath of a sibling fight, the documents became symptoms rather than evidence." Martin glanced at me. "Is this about the dinner delay?" Victor said, "Among other things." Martin had been at the wedding. He was also the person whose joke had triggered Sabrina's comment in the first place. His expression tightened slightly. "I'd like the actual sequence." I opened the incident file. I did not retell the humiliation. I did not repeat Sabrina's sentence about sending me to the kitchen. I gave the board the operational facts. The East Service Corridor had been identified during the November walkthrough as required for plated dinner. The restriction had been logged. Sabrina had been given alternatives. At 6:47 p.m. on the wedding day, she approved extending the floral installation. At 6:58, The banquet director found the service route obstructed and paused plated service under venue procedure. The installation was modified, and service resumed approximately 18 minutes late. A director asked, "Did Renee order the pause?" The banquet director's report answered that. "No." "Did she order the flowers installed?" "No." Sabrina spoke for the first time. She knew what would happen and didn't warn me again. I looked across the table. "That's true." One of Victor's allies frowned. "You admit that?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because Sabrina had been warned during the walkthrough, reminded again on the wedding day, and had just told the people around her that I had no authority. I stopped overriding a decision that belonged to her." Victor said, "Which is exactly the attitude I'm talking about." Martin shook his head. "No. What I'm hearing is a responsibility problem. Someone had decision authority, made the decision, then expected someone else to absorb the consequence." He looked at the rest of the board. "The wedding incident by itself is not a governance crisis, but I understand why it is relevant. That was all I needed it to be. The wedding was not evidence that Sabrina was unfit to lead a company. It was evidence of a pattern the larger documents made harder to ignore." The next item was the leadership deck. I showed the original version with separate commercial and operational initiatives, followed by the later composite version titled Sabrina Caldwell Leadership Initiatives. The staffing redesign Marcus, Elena, and I had built was there. Vendor consolidation was there. Hawthorne's margin improvements were there. Sabrina had contributed to some of the commercial outcomes around those programs, but she had not originated or managed the operational work. Victor said, "Executive presentations summarize cross-functional results under leaders all the time." "I agree," I said. That surprised him. I continued. "That's why I did not remove Sabrina from every initiative. I corrected the ownership so the board could distinguish sponsorship, operational leadership, and contributors." Martin asked Sabrina whether she had reviewed the earlier deck. She could have lied. She did not. "Yes." "Did you notice those initiatives were presented under your name?" "Yes." "Why didn't you correct them?" Sabrina glanced at Victor, then back at Martin. "Dad said the deck was presenting executive impact, not project authorship. I thought that was how he wanted the succession materials framed." "Did you believe the slide overstated your direct operational role?" She hesitated. "Yes." That answer cost her something. I could see it. One of the directors asked whether I believed Sabrina had no legitimate contribution to the company's performance. "No," I said. "That would be false. Her client work is strong. National account growth is strong. Brand positioning improved under her. My objection is not that she did nothing. My objection is presenting other people's work as proof she already performed a role she had not yet held." Sabrina looked at me differently after that. Not gratefully. Maybe simply surprised that I had not used the room to erase her in return. Then we reached the forecast. That was where the meeting stopped feeling like a family dispute at all. I walked the board through the staffing assumptions without embellishment. The original operating model had accelerated 2 general manager promotions, added a permanent operations director, and included more integration and training support. The later version delayed the promotions, removed the director, reduced transition costs, and still assumed both acquired venues could be integrated on an aggressive timetable. A director asked, "Can it be done?" "With enough things going right, probably." That isn't a very comforting answer. It isn't supposed to be. You ask whether it is physically possible. Yes. You're asking me to certify whether it is reasonably supportable as the operating plan. Under the current assumptions, my answer is no. Victor said, "Because you're leaving." "No. Even if I stayed, I would not certify this version." Claire walked through the financial impact of adding back the resources operations requested. The deal still existed. The margins were simply less attractive. Victor said, "We can make hiring decisions after closing." I answered, "Then the model should show that possibility, instead of assuming existing management absorbs the work for free." One director asked what the lender currently believed. Counsel answered before I did. The lender knows the retention agreement was never executed. After Renee declined it and resigned, the facility went back into management risk review. There has been no representation to the lender that an executed retention agreement exists. So no lender fraud. Correct. Then what is the problem? Claire answered. The lender underwrote a management structure that is changing while 2 transactions are on an exclusivity clock. They want a credible replacement structure before moving forward. Martin looked toward Victor. Which returns us to the internal statement that continuity was secure when it was not. Victor's patience finally broke. We are treating an ordinary founder judgment as if I falsified financial statements. No one said that, Martin replied. You're implying dishonesty. I'm saying the board was given certainty where uncertainty existed. The room went still. That was the point where I understood my father was losing them. Not because of me. Not because of Sabrina's wedding. Because every time someone narrowed the issue to what he had actually done, Victor tried to widen it into an attack on his character. He could defend a business decision. He could not tolerate the idea that he had exceeded his right to make one. The board turned to Sabrina next. Martin spoke gently. Assume Renee leaves May 20th. Assume the lender requires a revised management plan. What is your operating recommendation if both acquisitions remain available? Sabrina did well at first. She talked about preserving client confidence, separating the public brand transition from internal leadership changes, and communicating early with major accounts. All good answers. Then Martin asked, operationally? She paused. We would strengthen venue leadership. How? Accelerate internal promotions where appropriate. Which ones? She looked down at the staffing model. Another director asked, would you integrate both properties on the same schedule? I'd want to understand the staffing impact first. You have the staffing analysis. Sabrina's eyes moved toward me. I felt every old reflex in my body wake up. I knew how I would answer. I knew which property I would integrate first. Which general manager I would promote. Where I would place Elena. And which technology migration I would delay. I did nothing. Sabrina kept looking at me for another second. I said, that's hers to answer. Her face flushed. Then she looked back at the board and did the best thing she had done all morning. I don't know yet. Victor shifted in his chair. Sabrina continued. I know what I would want commercially. I don't have enough operational experience to pretend I can give you the integration sequence without working through it with the people who do. It was an honest answer. It was also an answer that made the proposed immediate presidency much harder to defend. Victor jumped in. Which is why a president has an operations team. Martin said, yes. But your proposal assumed a specific operations leader would remain for 3 years. She is leaving in 90 days. The distinction hung there. Sabrina had not failed because she could not answer one question. She had failed because the plan for her readiness had quietly depended on my permanence. The board went into executive session. I waited in an empty conference room with Sabrina while Victor remained inside. For almost 20 minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Sabrina said, did you want this? I looked at her. What part? Me losing it. I wanted the board to know what they were actually approving. That's not an answer. No, I did not wake up wanting you humiliated. She looked down at her hands. But I'm also not going to lie and say I wanted your appointment approved under the structure Dad built. She nodded slightly. When we were called back in, Martin delivered the outcome. By 5 votes to 2, the board withdrew the proposed immediate appointment of Sabrina as president and directed that the role be included in a broader external executive search. Sabrina would remain in brand and partnerships under her existing authority while the review continued. Then came Victor. The board had also voted 5-2 to begin an executive transition. Victor would leave the CEO role no later than March 31st. He would retain his 42% equity and the founder title. But after the transition, he would no longer exercise day-to-day executive authority. An interim governance structure would operate while the board conducted the search. My father did not move for several seconds. The company he had built still existed. His shares still existed. His name was still on the buildings. But he had lost the thing he had spent months trying hardest to preserve, the right to decide alone what happened next. The financing facility remained under review. Nobody declared the acquisitions dead. The seller's deadlines were still several weeks away, and the board authorized management to present a revised staffing and leadership plan to the lender. Then Martin looked at me. "There's one more question." I already knew what it was. "Would you be willing to be considered in the executive search?" Victor turned toward me. So did Sabrina. For years, I had imagined recognition as the answer. If Dad would just see what I did. If someone would finally admit I could lead. If the room would stop treating me as the machinery behind the wall. Now the room was offering me the chance. "No," I said. Martin studied me. "You're certain?" "Yes." Victor stared at me as though I had broken the rules of an argument only he understood. "You did all of this, and you don't even want the job?" "I didn't do this to get the job." "Then what was the point?" I looked at him. Choice. After the meeting, he caught me outside the boardroom. "You knew refusing that signature could cost us the expansion. I knew signing it would make your assumption mine. We still have time." "Yes. You could withdraw your resignation. Certify a revised model. Give the lender what they need." I looked at my father, and for the first time I did not feel responsible for rescuing him from the consequences standing between us. "You could still save it," he said. I thought about how many times some version of those words had directed my adult life. "I spent most of my adult life saving your deals," I said. "This was the first one I let belong to you." I walked away before he could answer. My phone buzzed before I reached the elevator. It was Elena. I opened the message. "Your team knows. They're waiting for you." When I stepped off the elevator after the board meeting, Elena, Marcus, and Hannah were exactly where Elena had said they would be. They had taken over the small conference room beside my office, although nobody appeared to be having a meeting. Marcus was standing by the window with his arms folded. Hannah had a paper cup she had clearly forgotten to drink from. Elena sat at the end of the table and watched me come through the door. Nobody asked whether I had won. That was one of the reasons I loved them. Marcus spoke first. "How bad?" "Victor is transitioning out as CEO by the end of March. Sabrina's appointment was withdrawn. The board is opening the president's search." Hannah stared at me. "And you?" I declined to be considered. Marcus closed his eyes. "Of course you did. What does that mean?" "It means you finally get offered the biggest office in the building and decide you don't want the building." Elena looked at me. "Are you still leaving?" "Yes." Marcus dropped into a chair. "I was hoping you were going to say the board fixed everything." "The board fixed a governance problem. That doesn't change why I resigned." Elena nodded slowly. She understood before the others did. "You don't trust yourself not to become the same solution in a different title." That was close enough to hurt. "I spent too long believing the answer was getting enough authority to carry everything properly," I said. "Maybe the answer is not carrying everything." Hannah looked down at her cup. "I still hate this." "I know. What do you need from us?" Elena asked. I almost answered automatically. Nothing. I had spent most of my life treating needing people as a weakness and being needed as proof that I mattered. Instead, I thought about the next 3 months. "I need you to tell me when the transition plan is stupid." Marcus smiled. "Finally, a responsibility I'm qualified for. I need Hannah to stop checking my work before she trusts her own." Hannah frowned. "That feels targeted." "It is." "And Elena?" I looked at her. "I need Elena to stop pretending she isn't terrified." Elena gave me a flat look. "I was doing very well until that. You asked me if I was scared when I told you I was leaving? And? I'm still terrified." Marcus stared at me. "You?" "Yes, Marcus. Turns out anxiety is available to senior executives too." Elena smiled. "Good." I pointed at her. "You people really need a new response." "No," she said. "You need to hear it. If you weren't scared, I'd worry you were running away. You're scared because you know exactly what you're leaving." She was right. That was the painful part. I was not escaping a company I hated. I was leaving people I loved, work I understood, buildings where I knew which hallway flooded during a hard storm and which loading dock driver would show up 20 minutes early every single time. I was leaving a place where I could walk into almost any problem and know what to do. For once, familiarity was not going to make the decision for me. The consequences for Victor did not arrive that weekend. Real business rarely punishes people on a dramatic schedule. The lender spent March reviewing a revised management plan. The board authorized searches for additional operating leadership and reduced the assumption that 2 new properties could be absorbed with almost no added management cost. Claire rebuilt the financing model. The numbers still worked, but less beautifully than Victor's version had. The sellers did not care about our family lessons. Near the end of March, the owner of the Western property declined to extend our exclusivity period. The backup bidder returned with financing already lined up, and within days that venue was effectively gone. Victor called me the afternoon we received confirmation. We could have closed that deal. Maybe. You know we could have. We could have presented a credible operating structure earlier. Silence. Then he said, "You still think this has nothing to do with you?" "I think my decision affected the deal. I don't think that makes the decision wrong." He hung up. The second acquisition lasted another week. The Murfreesboro seller had been more patient, but patience had a price. Another buyer came in with stronger terms and fewer financing conditions. In early April, they accepted the competing offer. Caldwell Event Group did not collapse. Nobody missed payroll. None of our 5 venues closed. The company simply remained a 5-property company instead of becoming 7. For Victor, that was punishment enough. He had spent nearly a year describing the acquisitions as the next chapter of his legacy. By March 31st, he was no longer CEO. By early April, both deals were gone. He kept his shares, his founder title, his money, and the building with Caldwell on the front. What he lost was the right to assume that because he had created the company, everyone inside it was another resource he could assign. During my notice period, I refused to turn transition into another form of martyrdom. I did not work 16-hour days so I could leave behind a perfect world. We had a schedule. Every week, authority moved. Elena began attending meetings that previously came automatically to me. Marcus joined budget reviews and learned that finance people could turn a 10-minute staffing question into 45 minutes of acronyms. Hannah started leading forecast sessions while I sat farther down the table and kept my mouth shut unless she actually needed me. Victor tested the boundary once. One of the acquisition cleanup issues extended beyond the original deal team, and he called me even though he was no longer CEO. "You should stay through June," he said, "just to stabilize operations after all this." "No. 4 weeks. No. The team needs you. The team needs authority. I already gave the board the names. Elena isn't ready for everything. Neither was I when you started giving me everything. That's different. It usually is when you need something from me." I ended the conversation without negotiating against myself. Elena went through a real review process. I was not in the room when the board interviewed her for permanent leadership because I had asked not to be. Recommending her was appropriate. Selecting her was not my decision. A few weeks before I left, she presented the quarterly operations update to the board. I sat along the side wall as an outgoing executive rather than at my old place near Victor. Halfway through the presentation, one director asked what Elena planned to do if seasonal labor costs rose another 6%, while 2 venues were already behind margin targets. Elena stopped. Her eyes moved toward me. I knew the answer I would have given. I did not give it. I only nodded once. She looked back at the board. I wouldn't cut labor across all 5 properties. The variance is concentrated in 2 venues, and one of those is caused by agency dependence rather than total hours. I'd address those staffing pipelines before I damage service somewhere that isn't creating the problem. The director asked 2 follow-up questions. She answered both. Afterward, Elena caught me in the hallway. "You knew the answer." "Yep." "You could have helped." "Yep." She stared at me. I smiled. "You didn't need me." For a second, she looked annoyed. Then she smiled too. That moment mattered more to me than the board offering me the president's search ever had. My last week arrived before I was ready for it. Because my resignation letter had created some confusion over the exact count of 90 days, HR and I had settled the final working date during the last week of May rather than turning a calendar into another family argument. By then, most of my permissions had already been reassigned. Elena owned the executive operations calendar. Marcus had workforce authority he had been ready for long before anyone formally gave it to him. Hannah was running reports without leaving them on my desk for approval. On my final morning, Marcus sent me an invitation titled 10-Minute Operations Review. I should have known. When I opened the conference room door, about 15 people were inside. There was grocery store cake on the table, coffee in mismatched cups, and an agenda printed in unnecessarily large letters. Marcus handed it to me. 1. Renee leaves. 2. We complain. 3. Cake. I looked at him. This is not an operations meeting. There is an agenda. That is not the standard. Leadership changes. Elena said. We know you hate speeches. Correct. So nobody prepared one. Thank God. Marcus lifted 6 stapled pages from behind his back. We prepared 6. I laughed hard enough that I had to put down my coffee. They did not actually make 6 speeches. Elena said a few words. Marcus made fun of me. Hannah cried and then became angry because she was crying, which made the rest of us laugh until she did too. Eventually, somebody asked what I was proudest of. The margin improvement, Marcus suggested. No. 5 venues that have survived your personality? Closer. I looked around the room. There was a time when every bad phone call came to me, I said. Every staffing problem, every vendor crisis, every client issue nobody wanted to own. And I thought that was evidence I was doing something right. Elena smiled because she knew where I was going. Now half the time I hear about a problem after one of you already solved it. That used to scare me. Marcus said. We know. Now, it's my favorite thing about this place. I looked at Hannah. Make mistakes. She nodded. At reasonable cost. She laughed. I looked at all of them. Take care of each other, but don't rescue each other from everything. Hannah said, Is that advice for us or you? Yes. Then Marcus handed me a binder. It was empty. Across the front, someone had printed, Things Rennie does not have to fix. I laughed first. Then, to my considerable annoyance, I cried. I started my new job in early June. The title was Regional Vice President of Operations. Exactly as negotiated. The authority was written down. So were the limits. Nobody asked me to pretend a relationship existed where a reporting line should have been. The work was unfamiliar enough to make me uncomfortable, which turned out to be good for me. Back at Caldwell, Elena completed her formal review and was named Senior Vice President of Operations later that month. Marcus became Director of Workforce Operations. Neither announcement required me to make a phone call. About a month after I left, Marcus called me during lunch. We have a staffing problem. My body reacted before my brain did. How bad? Relax. I'm not calling for help. I stopped. I'm calling to tell you we fixed it. Oh. He laughed. You sound disappointed. Shut up. Thought you'd want to know. I did. My voice softened before I could stop it. I really did. By July, Sabrina had accepted that the president role was not coming back. She stayed in brand and partnerships for several months under clearer performance goals, then announced she intended to leave and build a boutique branding firm of her own. I did not know whether it would succeed. I hoped it would. For all our anger, I had never wanted my sister to fail at the things she was genuinely good at. Mom took longer. She called one Sunday and said, Your father made one mistake. No, Mom, he made the same decision for years. That's not fair. It doesn't have to feel fair to be true. I still saw her. I still went to dinner occasionally. What I stopped doing was allowing every invitation to become a backdoor into Caldwell business. When she asked whether I could just talk to Sabrina about something happening at the company, I said no. When she offered to carry a message from Dad, I told her he had my number. That boundary disappointed her. It did not kill her. In late July, Hannah texted me. I took the job. I knew she had been interviewing for an operations strategy manager role outside Caldwell, but I had deliberately stayed out of it. Good, I wrote. 3 dots appeared. That's all? What do you want, balloons? A little enthusiasm. I smiled at my phone. I'm proud of you. Now ask for 10% more. Her answer came immediately. There she is. By August, which is when I'm telling you this, Caldwell Event Group was still standing. That might surprise anyone who expected revenge to end with my father's company collapsing the second I walked out. It didn't. That was never the victory I wanted. A good leader does not prove her importance by leaving behind ruins. If the entire system had fallen apart without me, I would have had to admit I had spent years building dependence instead of leadership. The people I cared about were okay. The company was okay. What had failed was Victor's plan. He called me one evening in August. We had not spoken much since spring. After a few minutes of careful conversation, he finally said, "You know, Sabrina couldn't have run this alone." I looked out the window of my apartment and thought about the wedding, the kitchen, the flowers blocking a corridor, the succession chart, the unsigned agreement, and all those years I had wondered whether my father truly understood what I did. He had. That was the part that had taken me longest to accept. "That was never the problem, Dad," I said. "The problem was that you knew it too." He did not answer. For once, I did not fill the silence for him. You should never confuse being needed with being respected. If people value you only because you constantly fix their mistakes, set clear boundaries, and make responsibility match authority, helping others does not mean carrying consequences they created for themselves, and protecting your team does not require sacrificing your future. Document important decisions, speak honestly, and know when to stop rescuing people who refuse to change. Sometimes the wisest choice is not taking the promotion, winning the argument, or destroying the people who hurt you. It is choosing a healthier life. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more family revenge stories.